Chief Cain slammed his fist on the metal table so hard the half-empty coffee cups jumped, their dark liquid sloshing over the rims and staining the topographical maps spread out between them. The sound was like a gunshot in the cramped, humid confines of the briefing tent. His face was inches from Kira's, his skin a mottled, angry red, and she could feel the heat radiating off him. Spit flew with every jagged word he barked, landing on her cheek, but she didn't move. She didn't even blink. "You think you belong here, Ashford?" Cain's voice was a low, dangerous growl that vibrated in his chest. "You're a goddamn liability. A communications specialist who can't even handle basic field ops without looking like she's about to faint. You know what you are to this team? You're dead weight. And tomorrow, your incompetence is going to get real soldiers killed. Real men who actually earned their place in this sand-blasted hellhole." Behind him, the other SEALs in the tent let out a collective laugh. It wasn't the sound of polite chuckles or friendly ribbing among teammates. It was raw, cruel laughter that cut deeper than any blade, a sound fueled by months of resentment and the elitism of the Brotherhood. To them, she was an interloper, a diversity hire, a girl playing soldier in a playground where only giants were allowed. Kira stood there in a state of perfect, terrifying stillness. Her hands were clasped firmly behind her back, her spine a straight line of tempered steel. Her eyes were fixed on a point just past Cain's shoulder, staring at a wrinkle in the canvas of the tent. She didn't flinch, didn't argue, and didn't offer a single word of defense. She just took it, absorbing the venom like she always did. But if you looked closely, really closely, you'd see her right thumb pressing rhythmically against her left wrist. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a rhythm only she understood, a cadence of survival that kept the world from spinning out of control. Before we dive deeper into this explosive story and witness the hidden truth behind Kira Ashford, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the moment the hunters become the hunted. And drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story travels. Trust me, you won't believe where this goes or the secret Kira is desperate to keep buried. The Afghanistan sun was a hammer, and FOB Sentinel was the anvil. The heat was a physical weight, a thick, dusty blanket that made every breath feel like inhaling fine-grit sandpaper. Kira Ashford had been on this base for 6 weeks, and every single day had been a master class in systematic humiliation. She wasn't supposed to be here. That was the mantra of the base. It was the whisper in the hallways and the shout in the training yard. They said it to her face, they sneered it behind her back, and they muttered it in the mess hall while she ate alone. They said it in the showers where the water was never hot enough to wash away the feeling of being unwanted. And they definitely said it in the rec room where the SEALs gathered after missions to drink contraband beer and swap stories of valor. Kira was never the hero of those stories. She was the punchline. At 26 years old, she was a small figure among giants, 5'6" and barely 130 pounds soaking wet. She looked like a stiff breeze could knock her over. Her dark hair was always pulled back into a regulation bun, so tight it looked painful, framing green eyes, that she kept downcast most of the time to avoid the glares of her superiors. Her voice was so quiet, so devoid of the bravado that defined the culture of the FOB, that people often asked her to repeat herself just to mock her again. Her uniform was always perfect, her boots always shined to a mirror finish, and her technical work as a communications specialist was absolutely flawless. None of it mattered. In a world built on the ability to kick down doors and pull triggers, her mastery of encrypted frequencies and satellite handshakes was seen as a parlor trick. "Hey, Ashford," Petty Officer Martinez called out as she crossed the motor pool, the scent of diesel and hot rubber hanging heavy in the air. "Try not to trip over your own shadow tomorrow, yeah. Some of us actually have families we'd like to see again." The men around him erupted in another round of mocking laughter, the sound echoing off the armored hulls of the MRAPs. Kira kept walking. She'd learned early on that responding only fueled the fire. They wanted a reaction. They wanted her to cry, to scream, or to lash out so they could finally have the proof they needed that she was too emotional for the wire. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly guess, was that every insult, every jeer, and every dismissive comment rolled off her like rain off a windshield. Kira Ashford had survived something far worse than the mockery of a few arrogant operators. She'd survived her father's training. Marcus Ashford had been a ghost in the machine, a legend spoken of in hushed tones in the dark corners of the Pentagon, though few people knew his real name. In 20 years of service, he had over 200 confirmed kills, and likely dozens more that stayed off the books. He was the man who could hit a target at 1,800 meters in crosswinds that would make other snipers pack up and go home. He'd operated in 14 different countries, extracting high-value targets and eliminating threats that would have sparked international incidents if the world had known they existed. And then, the man of steel had been taken down by a whisper of biology: pancreatic cancer. The man who had survived bullets, wides, and the most hostile environments on Earth was betrayed by his own cells. Kira had been 19 when the diagnosis came, and 20 when he finally passed. But in that final year, Marcus Ashford had done something he'd never done before. He trained his daughter, not because she asked, she hadn't. Not because he wanted her to follow in his blood-stained footsteps. He'd actually argued against it with the last of his strength. He did it because, as he'd said in that quiet, matter-of-fact way of his, the world was a dangerous place, and he wouldn't always be there to stand between her and the dark. So he taught her everything. He taught her how to read the wind by watching the subtle sway of grass 200 meters away. He taught her how to calculate bullet drop in her head faster than most people could type into a ballistic computer. He taught her how to control her autonomic nervous system, slowing her breathing until her heart rate dropped to 40 beats per minute, turning her body into a steady, unmoving platform. He taught her how to become invisible in plain sight, and most importantly, he taught her how to kill. She had hated every second of it. She hated the oily smell of the rifle and the cold precision her father demanded. She hated the way he would look at her with those calm, analytical eyes that saw through people like they were made of glass, and say things like, "You're overthinking the shot, Kira. The target doesn't care about your feelings, and neither should you. Focus on the math. The math is the only thing that's real." When he finally died, she had made her mother a solemn promise. Never again. She would never pick up a rifle again. She would serve her country if she felt the call, but she would do it in the light. She would do something safe, something technical, something that didn't require her to become the shadow her father had been. That was how she ended up as a communications specialist. Radios, satellite links, data encryption. It was vital work, but it was safe. Or it was supposed to be, until she was deployed to FOB Sentinel, and until Chief Petty Officer Cain decided she was his personal project in demonstrating why women didn't belong on the front lines. The briefing tent was stifling, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, and the hum of portable air conditioners struggling against the Afghan heat. 15 SEALs, 2 Army Rangers serving as liaisons, and Kira sat in the cramped space. She was tucked in the back, her laptop open, meticulously checking the communication protocols for the next day's mission. Cain stood at the front, a laser pointer in his hand, his face still flushed. "Listen up," he barked, clicking a button. "Tomorrow's a convoy run to OP Dakota, 3 vehicles, standard security sweep. Intel says the route's clear, but we all know Intel's been smoking their own supply lately." A topographic map appeared on the screen, showing a winding mountain road that snaked through a deep, narrow valley. Kira's eyes fixed on the map immediately. Her father's training, dormant but never truly gone, kicked in automatically. Her brain began to overlay the map with firing positions, lines of sight, and escape routes. "Always read the terrain first," her father's voice whispered in her mind. Terrain doesn't lie, but men do. The valley was a natural funnel, high ground on both sides, limited egress points, and dozens of blind corners. If she were planning an ambush, this is exactly where she'd set the trap. Her thumb started pressing against her wrist again. 1, 2, 3, 4, Ashford, she looked up. Cain was staring at her, his lip curled in a sneer. "You got something to say? You're staring at that map like you're trying to find a shortcut to a nail salon." Every eye in the tent turned to her. She felt her chest tighten, the familiar weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her. She cleared her throat, her voice coming out small and thin. "No, Chief, then stop fidgeting. You're distracting people who actually matter to the mission." More laughter rippled through the tent. She dropped her hands to her lap and kept her head down. Cain continued, outlining the formation. "We'll have 3 vehicles. Lead vehicle is Martinez's team. Middle is the supply truck with the extra ammo and gear. Rear vehicle is my team. Ashford, you're in the middle vehicle." It was the standard play. They always put her in the middle, the safest position, the spot reserved for the people they didn't trust to hold a flank. We'll also need someone at relay point Beta, Cain added, clicking to a new slide. It showed a jagged ridge overlooking the valley. We need a communication relay to make sure we stay in constant contact with the base. The mountains out here eat radio signals for breakfast. Kira's blood went cold as she looked at the ridge. That specific spot was the worst possible tactical position on the entire map. It was completely exposed, a bald crown of rock with no natural cover. It had perfect sightlines into the valley, which meant anyone on that ridge could see everything, but it also worked both ways. Anyone in the valley with a decent optic would see the relay team immediately. If an enemy wanted to take out their communications, that's exactly where they would focus their fire. "Who's on the relay?" one of the SEALs asked. Cain smiled, and it was a cold, predatory expression. "Ashford. Since communications is her specialty, she can spend the morning enjoying the view." The tent went quiet. Even Martinez, who had been mocking her minutes ago, looked slightly uncomfortable. The relay point was a death trap if things went sideways. "Chief, that position is pretty exposed," Martinez said tentatively. "And Ashford is, well, she's good at the tech, but she's alone up there." Cain's smile widened. "Are you questioning my deployment, Martinez? Or did Ashford lie on her resume about being able to handle a little fresh air?" Kira's hands were shaking now. She pressed them harder against her thighs until her knuckles turned white. "I can do it," she said quietly. "Speak up, specialist. I can't hear you over the sound of your courage. I said I can do it, Chief." Cain nodded, satisfied with himself. "Good. Wheels up at 0600. Don't be late or we'll leave you for the goats." The briefing broke up and the SEALs filed out. Some shot Kira sympathetic looks, their bravado momentarily dampened by the reality of the suicide mission she'd just been handed. Others avoided her eyes entirely. She stayed in her chair, staring at the map still projected on the screen, the lines and shadows of the valley etched into her memory. Kira. She turned to see Commander Donovan Duke Brennan standing in the entrance of the tent. He was 52, silver-haired, with deep lines around his eyes that came from decades of squinting through scopes and into hostile territory. He'd been a SEAL for 30 years, a man of immense respect and quiet power. He had also been her father's best friend. "Sir," she said, standing up. "Walk with me," Duke commanded. They left the tent and walked toward the perimeter fence. The sun was setting, painting the jagged Afghan mountains in shades of bruised orange and deep red. It was beautiful in a way that felt deceptive, a gorgeous mask over a land that wanted them dead. "Cain's out of line," Duke said quietly, his voice low so it wouldn't carry. "I can reassign you. I can put one of the Rangers on that relay and keep you in the MRAP." "No," Kira replied firmly. "If you reassign me, it proves everything he says about me, that I can't handle the pressure, that I don't belong." Duke stopped and turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "Your father told me about you, Kira, about what he taught you during that last year." Kira's jaw tightened, a flash of old anger sparking in her chest. "I'm not my father, Duke. I told you that when I signed up. I'm a comms specialist." "I know," Duke said gently, "but you're better than you let them see." She laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the sound of dry leaves skittering over pavement. "Better? I haven't touched a rifle in 6 years. I made my mother a promise. I'm not that person." "Your mother made you promise because she was scared," Duke said, his voice dropping an octave. "She was scared of losing you the same way she lost Marcus. She wanted to protect you from the shadow. But Marcus, he'd understand what you're doing, hiding your skills to fit in, trying to be something you're not. But he'd also tell you that tomorrow that relay position is a kill box. He wouldn't let you go up there unarmed in spirit." "I know the risks," Kira said. "I'll set up the equipment, maintain the link, and do my job. That's why I'm here." Duke studied her for a long moment, the silence between them filled only by the distant hum of the base generators. "Do you know what your father's last words to me were? Right before the end?" Kira didn't answer. He said, "Duke, she's better than I ever was. She has the gift. But she's too kind. If she ever picks up a rifle again, it'll be because she has no choice. And when that day comes, watch over her because she'll need someone who understands the weight of what she's about to do." Kira's eyes burned, and she had to blink hard against the sudden threat of tears. "I don't want to be what he was. I don't want that darkness." "Then don't be," Duke said, placing a heavy, calloused hand on her shoulder. "Be what you are. But if things go wrong tomorrow, remember this. Your father would be proud of whatever choice you make to stay alive." He walked away, leaving her alone with the cooling air and the weight of words she had spent years trying to forget. That night, Kira didn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, staring at the corrugated metal ceiling of the barracks, listening to the symphony of the FOB. The generators hummed a constant bass note, interrupted by the occasional bark of a guard dog or the distant, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter taking off for a night op. Somewhere across the compound, someone was playing a guitar badly, the notes drifting through the thin walls. She thought about her father's hands, how they were always steady even when the rest of him was failing. She thought about the map, the valley, and the ridge. Her fingers moved in the darkness, tapping against her collarbone. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was the rhythm of a heartbeat, a reminder to stay grounded. At 0530, she was up. She dressed in silence, the movements mechanical. She checked her radio equipment 3 times, ensuring every battery was charged and every cable was coiled perfectly. She grabbed her standard-issue M4 carbine, the weapon she had qualified with but never truly cared for. It felt like a plastic toy compared to the heavy, precision instruments her father had prized. She avoided looking at herself in the small, cracked mirror above the sink. She didn't want to see the ghost staring back. The motor pool was a hive of activity. SEALs were loading heavy crates of ammunition, checking their NVGs, and performing the 1,000 little rituals that kept the fear at bay. Cain saw her and let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Ashford, try not to drop the radio on your foot, yeah? We don't have any extra medics for bruised toes." She ignored him, loading her gear into the middle MRAP. Martinez walked past, paused, and looked at her for a second. There was no mockery in his eyes this time, only a grim sort of recognition. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "For what it's worth, good luck up there. Keep your head down." "Thanks, Martinez," she replied, surprised by the sudden flash of sincerity. At 0600 sharp, the convoy rolled out. 3 massive armored vehicles kicked up clouds of fine yellow dust as they rumbled through the main gate. The drive to the relay point took 40 minutes of jarring, bone-shaking travel over unpaved tracks. Kira sat in the back of the middle vehicle, squeezed between crates of 5.56 ammo and a young army specialist named Chen. He was 19 with a face that still looked like it belonged in a high school yearbook. He was gripping his rifle so hard his knuckles were white. "First convoy?" Kira asked. He nodded, not looking at her. "Is it always this quiet?" "It's the quiet before the noise," she said, her father's words slipping out before she could stop them. Chen didn't look reassured. When they reached the base of the ridge, the convoy slowed. Kira grabbed her heavy packs of gear and jumped out of the MRAP. The goat path leading to the summit was narrow and treacherous, barely wide enough for a human, let alone a vehicle. The MRAP stayed below as she climbed, her lungs burning in the thin mountain air. When she reached the top, the view was breathtaking and terrifying. The entire valley spread out below her like a surgeon's diagram. She could see the convoy route, a dark, dusty line cutting through the gray-brown terrain. It was a perfect ambush zone. Cain's voice crackled over the radio, loud and abrasive. "Ashford, comm check." She set up her equipment with practiced efficiency, her hands moving with a speed that would have surprised the men below. Satellite dish deployed, relay station synced, backup frequencies locked. "Comm check good, Chief. You're 5x5. Try to keep it that way," Cain grunted. The convoy continued its descent into the valley. Kira watched through her binoculars, tracking their progress. The sun was fully up now, the heat shimmering off the valley floor in waves. Her radio crackled with the mundane chatter of the mission, position reports, status checks, and the occasional crude joke. It felt routine. It felt safe. Then Martinez's voice cut through the air, tight and sharp. "Duke, we've got something. 11 o'clock, high ground, probable scout." Kira swung her binoculars toward the ridge opposite her own. She saw it immediately, a flash of light metal catching the sun. Her heart skipped a beat. That wasn't a scout. That was a lens. The world exploded. A massive fireball erupted from the side of the lead MRAP as an RPG struck it dead center. The sound was a physical blow, a thunderous roar that rattled Kira's teeth even from her high vantage point. Before the echoes of the blast had even died away, the firing started. It wasn't just 1 or 2 shooters. It was a coordinated, overwhelming volume of fire coming from 6, 8, 10 different positions. The insurgents had been waiting. They had set the perfect trap. Contact, multiple positions, return fire. Cain's voice was no longer mocking. It was a roar of pure command, though she could hear the underlying strain of a man who realized he'd walked into a meat grinder. Kira's hands moved automatically, her mind splitting into 2 distinct channels. One channel was the comms specialist, switching frequencies and calling back to the base. "FOB Sentinel, this is Relay Beta. Troops in contact. I repeat, troops in contact. Grid reference." She rattled off the coordinates with calm precision even as bullets began to kick up dust around her own position. They'd spotted her. Of course they had. She was a lone figure on a bald ridge. She dropped behind the low stone wall of her equipment, making herself as small as possible. The distinctive crack snap of rounds passing inches from her head filled the air. A bullet shattered the corner of the satellite dish, sending a shower of plastic and metal sparks into the air. She scrambled to stabilize the link, her hands shaking, but her mind beginning to go cold. Duke's voice came over the radio, strained. "Relay Beta, get down. We can manage without the link. Get to cover." But they couldn't. Not really. If the link went down, they were blind and deaf in a hole. They couldn't call for air support, they couldn't coordinate with the QRF, and they couldn't talk to each other across the chaos of the valley. Kira stayed up, one hand holding the damaged dish steady, the other keyed to the radio. "FOB Sentinel, we need air support. How copy?" The reply was a burst of static and a grim voice. "Relay Beta, nearest birds are 45 minutes out. Redirecting now." 45 minutes. In the valley below, the SEALs were being methodically picked apart. They were pinned between the burning lead vehicle and the disabled rear MRAP. Fire was raining down on them from both ridges. It was a kill box, and the insurgents were closing the lid. Another burst of fire hit the rocks near Kira's head, peppering her with stone chips. She tracked the source through her binoculars, a cluster of rocks 800 meters away on the opposite slope. 3 shooters. Her father's voice whispered in her ear, unbidden and crystalline. 800 meters, wind from the east 6 miles per hour. Elevation difference 60 meters. Easy shot, Kira. Why are you waiting? She shoved the voice away. "I'm not him," she whispered. "I'm not." Below, a scream tore through the radio. "Man down." "Chen's hit. We need a medic." Duke's voice was becoming ragged. "We're taking fire from the northern ridge. Does anyone have eyes on that sniper?" Kira swung her binoculars to the north. She found him, a well-concealed shooter tucked into a crevice nearly 900 meters away. He was a professional. He wasn't spraying and praying like the others. He was taking measured, deliberate shots. She watched through the glass as he fired again. A SEAL near the middle vehicle spun and fell, his body limp before he even hit the sand. That was 2 men down, then 3. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and death. Kira's heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, trapped animal. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm wasn't working anymore. She grabbed her M4, but as she looked through the basic red dot sight, she knew it was a joke. At this range, she might as well be throwing pebbles. "Air support. Where is our air support?" Cain screamed into the radio. 40 minutes. Kira shouted back, hating the words. "We don't have 40 minutes. Cain's voice broke. "We're dying down here." Kira watched as a group of insurgents began to move down the slopes, intent on flanking the remaining SEALs. They were going to finish it. They were going to walk down there and execute every single one of them. She looked at the M4 in her hands, then at the heavy gear bag she'd brought up from the supply vehicle. She'd grabbed it in the chaos of the departure, a long, heavy drag bag that the SEALs had tossed into the middle MRAP at the last second. Inside that bag was an M110 semi-automatic sniper system. It wasn't the bolt-action rifle her father had used, but it was close enough. It was a weapon designed for exactly what was happening right now. "No," she whispered, her mother's face flashing in her mind. "I promised." Another explosion rocked the valley. The rear MRAP was now a funeral pyre. She heard Chen's voice over the radio, a sobbing, wet sound. I'm hit bad. Mom, I'm sorry." The transmission ended in a gurgle. That was the breaking point. The promise to her mother, the fear of the darkness, the desire to be normal. It all burned away in the heat of the valley. Kira moved before she even realized she'd made the choice. She scrambled to the bag, her fingers flying over the zippers. She pulled out the M110. It was cold, heavy, and felt like a natural extension of her own body. The weight of it was a comfort she hadn't expected. She extended the bipod and dropped into a prone position behind a flat rock. She pulled the charging handle back, the metallic clack sounding like a bell in the mountain air. A round chambered. Through the high-powered loophole scope, the world changed. The chaos of the valley didn't disappear, but it became a series of problems to be solved. The fear was gone, replaced by the icy, analytical clarity that was her true inheritance. Northern Ridge sniper first. She found him in the crosshairs. He was 943 meters away. The wind was gusting now, pushing from the east at maybe 7 miles per hour. She adjusted the turrets with a subconscious flick of her fingers. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate plummeted. 40 beats, 35. The world narrowed down to the space between her heartbeat. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar, punishing kick. Through the scope, she saw the insurgent sniper's head snap back as the .308 round found its mark. He slumped forward, his rifle sliding down the rocks. She didn't feel horror, she didn't feel triumph. She felt nothing but the math. She shifted her aim to the western cluster of rocks. 820 meters, 3 shooters. She acquired the first one, adjusted for the slight change in angle, and fired again. 2. The other 2 insurgents scrambled, looking around in confusion. They didn't know where the fire was coming from. One made the mistake of standing up to run. 3. The last one went prone, trying to hide behind a low shelf of rock. Kira waited. She knew he would peek. They always peeked. 5 seconds, 10. There, a sliver of a head appeared. She squeezed. 4. Down in the valley, the volume of incoming fire was noticeably dropping. The SEALs, sensing a shift in the momentum, began to push back. Duke's voice crackled over the radio, filled with disbelief. "What the hell? Who's taking those shots? Is that air support?" "Relay Beta is engaging," Kira said, her voice completely flat, devoid of emotion. "I have the high ground. Stay in cover." Cain's voice came through, sounding stunned. "Ashford, is that you?" "Shut up and move your men to the vehicles, Chief," she said. "I'll clear the slope." She shifted her focus to the southern ridge. 3 shooters were suppressing Martinez's team. She worked through them with the cold efficiency of a machine. 5, 6, 7. Every shot was a testament to the man who had trained her, a man who had seen the killer in his daughter long before she had seen it in herself. An insurgent team tried to flank around the eastern slope, moving through a dry wash. They were over 1,000 meters away, a difficult shot even for a master. Kira didn't hesitate. She calculated the lead time, the windage, and the steep angle of the shot. She felt the ghost of her father standing over her, his hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Don't aim where he is, Kira. Aim where he's going to be." 8. The leader of the flanking team dropped. The others scattered, but there was no cover in the wash. She picked them off one by one as they tried to climb the steep banks. 9, 10, 11. The remaining insurgents were breaking now. The coordinated ambush had turned into a slaughter. They realized that someone on the ridge had turned the valley into a graveyard. They began to retreat, throwing away their weapons to move faster. Kira watched them through the scope. Her father would have told her to finish them all. He would have said that a retreating enemy is just an enemy who will kill you tomorrow. But Kira stopped. She let the last 3 run into the tree line. She sat up, her back against the cold stone, the M110 resting across her lap. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her breathing was slow and even. She looked down at the valley where smoke was still rising from the wrecks. She could see the SEALs moving, tending to the wounded, securing the perimeter. They were alive because of the darkness she had promised never to touch. Duke's voice came over the radio, quiet and weighted with 1,000 unspoken questions. "Relay Beta, Kira, we're clear. Status." "Link is stable, Commander," she said, her voice finally trembling just a little. "Air support is 5 minutes out." She leaned her head back against the rock and closed her eyes. She could feel the sun on her face, but for the first time in her life, she understood why her father had always preferred the shadows. She had saved them, but in doing so, she had become the one thing she feared most. She was no longer just the communications specialist. She was the ghost's daughter, and the world would never look at her the same way again. The shot was a long one, a very long shot. Kira adjusted her position on the rocky outcrop, the heat of the Afghan sun radiating off the stone and soaking into her uniform. The world through the scope was a different reality, a compressed, silent version of the chaos raging in the valley below. She adjusted for every variable the mountain could throw at her. The wind was a fickle beast, swirling through the draws and canyons, changing direction with every gust. She accounted for the distance, the thinning air of the high altitude, and the fact that her target was moving with the erratic, panicked energy of a man who thought he was winning. She made the calculations her father had taught her, the complex mathematical ballet of ballistics and geometry that she had tried so hard to forget. Her breath held steady, a hollow space in her chest where fear used to be. She squeezed the trigger. 13. The valley had gone almost quiet. It was a strange, heavy silence that followed the rhythmic pounding of heavy fire. The sound of the SEALs' weapons was still there, but it was no longer the frantic, uncoordinated roar of a team caught in a kill box. Kira didn't lower the rifle. She swept her scope across the jagged terrain one more time, her eyes moving in the systematic, predatory patterns she'd been raised to master. She was looking for threats, looking for any glint of glass or puff of dust that signaled someone else wanted to kill the men she was sworn to protect. She found one more. He was at 1,400 meters, an extreme range for the M110 she held in her hands. It was the kind of distance where the curve of the earth started to matter. The man was setting up a heavy machine gun on a high ledge, preparing to rain a fresh hell down on Duke's position. Kira didn't hesitate. She didn't have time for the luxury of doubt. She made the calculations in a heartbeat, holding the reticle high above the target to account for the massive drop the bullet would take over a mile of flight. She held for the wind, a slight lead to the left, and squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar, violent kick that felt more like a heartbeat than a machine. Through the glass, she saw the machine gunner drop before the sound of her shot could even reach him. 14. The valley was silent now, save for the voices of the SEALs filtering up through the radio. Their tones were urgent, professional, but the sharp edge of panic had been blunted. They were calling out all clears, moving through the smoke to check on their wounded and secure the perimeter. Kira stayed on the rifle. She didn't move a muscle, scanning the ridge lines, watching the shadows, protecting the men who didn't even know she was there. It had been 18 minutes. 18 minutes since she had taken her first shot. In that time, she had eliminated 14 targets. She hadn't missed once. She heard the sound of footsteps behind her, heavy tactical boots crunching on the dry shale. There were multiple people. She didn't turn around. She kept her eye glued to the scope, her finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. She heard Martinez's voice first, a low, stunned whisper that broke the silence. He cleared his throat, the sound wet and jagged. He said her name, but it sounded like a question, as if he couldn't quite believe the person lying in the dirt with a sniper rifle was the same girl who handled their radio frequencies. "Stay back," Duke's voice came next. It was quiet, calm, but possessed an authority that brooked no argument. "Give her space." Kira could feel them staring at her. More SEALs were arriving, fanning out around her position, their shadows stretching long across the dirt as the sun began its slow descent. Through the scope, she continued her work, scanning the valley with a professional, thorough detachment that felt like a cold shroud. "Relay Beta, this is Duke," the commander said into his comms. "Targets neutralized. Stand down." Kira's finger finally came off the trigger. She took a long, jagged breath, letting it out in a slow hiss. And then the shaking started. It began in her hands, a fine tremor that quickly spread to her arms and then her whole body. The adrenaline that had kept her steady was draining away, leaving behind a cold, hollow terror. She had killed 14 people in 18 minutes. She had saved her team, but in doing so, she had broken the only promise that mattered. She had become exactly what her father had been, a ghost in the hills, a dealer of sudden, distant death. Duke approached her slowly, his movements deliberate like he was approaching a spooked horse. "Kira," he said, his voice soft. "It's over. You can stand down now." She finally took her eye from the scope, the sudden brightness of the afternoon sun making her blink. She turned and saw the faces staring at her. Martinez, Cain, and half a dozen other SEALs who had scrambled up to her ridge. All of them were looking at her as if she were a stranger, as if they had never seen her before, and in a way they hadn't. Cain's face was particularly pale, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words that wouldn't come. Finally, he managed to choke out a question. "Who the hell are you?" Kira stood up slowly, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She looked down at the M110 in her hands, the black metal still warm from the sun and the firing. She looked at the men staring at her, and then at Duke, who was watching her with an expression that was a devastating mix of pride and profound sadness. She thought about her father, Marcus, and the way he used to look after a long day on the range. She thought about her mother, and the promise she had made 6 years ago to never pick up a weapon like this again. She thought about Chen, the kid with the baby face who had died calling for his mother, and the realization that if she hadn't picked up this rifle, they would all be dead. She looked Cain dead in the eye. Her voice was quiet, but in the stillness of the ridge, everyone heard it. "I'm Specialist Kira Ashford, Communications." But the words felt like a lie. They all knew it wasn't true anymore. The comms specialist was gone, buried under the weight of 14 bodies. The silence that followed was suffocating. Kira pressed her shaking hands hard against her thighs, trying to force the tremors to stop. "I can do it," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. Cain stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. He smelled of old tobacco, sweat, and the metallic tang of spent brass. "Speak up, Specialist," he barked, though the usual bite in his voice was tempered by a lingering shock. "I said I can do it, Chief," she said, louder this time, her voice gaining a hard, brittle edge. Cain's mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the smile of a predator who had just realized the prey was much more dangerous than he'd thought. "You sure about that, Ashford? Because that ridge is a long way from your safe little tent." No walls, no backup, just you and whatever decides to shoot at you. I understand, Chief, she replied. Do you? He leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her, though the air was so still it carried to the others anyway. Because I don't think you do. I think you're going to get up there, hear the first bullet crack past your head, and you're going to freeze. And when you freeze, good men are going to die because their comms went dark. Kira met his eyes. For the first time, she didn't look away. In that second, something passed between them, a cold, mutual understanding. Cain thought he saw fear in her eyes, but he was wrong. What he actually saw was calculation. He saw a girl who knew exactly how many grains of powder were in a cartridge and exactly how many inches a bullet would drop at 1,000 yards. I won't freeze, Chief, she said. Cain straightened up, looking disappointed that he hadn't managed to break her yet. We'll see, he muttered. Briefing's over. Get out. The SEALs filed out of the tent, some of them shooting Kira sympathetic looks, while others avoided her eyes entirely, as if her newfound lethality were a contagious disease. She stayed in her chair for a long time, staring at the map still projected on the screen. She saw the valley, the ridge, and the perfect kill zone. Her father would have seen it in seconds. He would have looked at that map and known exactly where the ambush would happen. He probably would have refused the mission entirely, called it a suicide run, and demanded better intelligence. But her father was gone, and she had spent years trying to outrun his shadow. Kira, a voice said. She turned to see Commander Donovan Duke Brennan standing in the entrance. He was 52 years old, with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent making impossible decisions. He had been a SEAL for 30 years, and more importantly, he had been her father's best friend. He was the only person on the entire base who knew the truth about her lineage. Sir, she said, standing up. Walk with me, Duke said. They left the tent and walked toward the perimeter of the forward operating base. The sun was setting, painting the jagged mountain peaks in violent shades of orange and bruised purple. It was a beautiful sight, provided you could forget that the mountains were filled with people trying to kill you. Duke didn't speak for a long time. He just walked, his hands clasped behind his back. Finally, he broke the silence. Cain was out of line. I can reassign you, Kira. You don't have to go back out there. No, she said, her voice firm. If you reassign me, it proves everything he says about me is right, that I can't handle it, that I don't belong here. Duke stopped and turned to face her. His eyes looked tired, older than she remembered. And if you don't come back tomorrow, what does that prove? That he was right to hate me, she replied. That's not. Duke caught himself and took a long breath. Your father told me about you, Kira. He told me everything he taught you. He knew what you were capable of. Kira's jaw tightened, every muscle in her body going rigid. I'm not my father. I know, Duke said softly, you're better. Kira laughed, but the sound was hollow, like something breaking in a dark room. Better? I haven't touched a rifle in 6 years, Duke. I made my mother a promise. I swore I'd never be the person he wanted me to be. Your mother made you promise because she was terrified, Duke said, his voice taking on the gentle tone he used when delivering bad news. She was scared of losing you the same way she lost him. But Marcus, he'd understand what you're doing. This isn't about being him. I'm not hiding anything, Kira insisted, though the lie felt heavy in her mouth. I'm just being who I want to be. Are you? Duke's question hung in the air like gunsmoke. Or are you being who you think your mother needs you to be? Kira didn't have an answer. She couldn't even look at him. Duke continued, his voice dropping lower. You know what your father's last words to me were, right before he died? I don't want to know, she said, her eyes burning. He said, Duke, she's better than I ever was, but she's too kind. If she ever picks up a rifle again, it'll be because she has no choice. And when that day comes, watch over her, because she'll need someone who understands. Kira blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. He shouldn't have trained me, she whispered. I was 19 years old. I should have been in college, worrying about exams and boys and normal things. I shouldn't have been learning how to take a life from 1,800 meters away. Maybe, Duke conceded, but he did train you, and now you have a choice to make. I already made my choice 6 years ago, she said. Duke nodded slowly. Then I'll respect that. But Kira, tomorrow, if things go wrong up on that ridge, remember this. Your father would be proud of whatever you choose, even if you choose to keep your promise and let the rifle stay in the bag. He walked away then, leaving her alone with the dying light and the crushing weight of words she had never wanted to hear. That night, Kira didn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bunk, staring at the corrugated metal ceiling and listening to the ambient noise of the FOB. The low hum of generators, the distant murmur of conversations, and the sound of someone nearby playing a guitar. They were playing the same 3 chords over and over, a repetitive, clumsy melody that felt like a heartbeat. She thought about her father. Specifically, she thought about the last time she had seen him alive. He had been in a hospital bed, a web of tubes and monitors surrounding him, his body failing but his mind as sharp as a razor. "You hate me," he had said. It wasn't a question. "I don't hate you," she had replied, though she hadn't been able to look him in the eye. "You hate what I taught you," he corrected. Same thing. She had wanted to argue, to tell him that it wasn't the same at all, but he was dying, and she couldn't bring herself to lie to a man on the brink of the void. "Why did you do it?" she had asked instead. "Why teach me all of that if you didn't want me to use it?" Marcus had smiled, a ghost of the hard, confident man he had once been. "Because the world is full of people like Cain, Kira. People who see kindness as a weakness and compassion as a vulnerability. One day, someone is going to try to hurt you because they think you can't fight back. So you taught me to kill them," she'd said, the bitterness sharp in her voice. "I taught you to survive them," he'd countered. "There's a difference. I don't see it." "You will," he'd said. He had reached out then, taking her hand with fingers that shook from the effort. "Promise me one thing, Kira, not about the rifle, not about the military. Promise me that whatever you choose it because it's right. Not because it's safe or because it's what someone else wants, but because it's the right thing to do," she had promised. And 6 months later, at his funeral, she had made her mother a different promise. A promise to never be a part of that world again. A promise that felt safe and easy, but now, sitting in the dark of a war zone, it felt entirely wrong. At 5:30 in the morning, Kira got up. She moved with mechanical precision, putting on her uniform and checking her radio equipment. She checked it 3 times, then a 4th, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. She grabbed her standard-issue M4 carbine. She had qualified with it, but she hated the weapon. It had a 40-pound trigger pull, mediocre accuracy past 300 meters, and was prone to jamming in the fine, powdery dust of the valley. It wasn't a precision instrument. It wasn't the kind of tool her father had trained her with. The motor pool was a scene of controlled chaos. SEALs were loading vehicles, checking weapons, and moving through the pre-mission rituals that kept the fear at bay. There was a rhythm to it, a religious intensity. Check your gear, check your buddy's gear, say a prayer if you were the praying type. Don't say goodbye because goodbye was bad luck. Cain saw her as she approached the MRAP. His face twisted into a sneer. "Last chance, Ashford," he said, stepping into her personal space. "Tell Duke you can't handle it. I'll think less of you, sure, but at least you'll be alive at the end of the day." For a split second, Kira considered it. She considered feigning an injury or an illness just to get away from the looming shadow of the ridge. Cain was right about one thing. The ridge was a death trap. But then she saw Martinez watching her, saw the other men pretending to be busy, and she saw the challenge in Cain's eyes. "I can handle it, Chief," she said. Cain's expression darkened. "Then I hope you've made peace with whatever God you believe in because you're going to meet him today." He turned and walked away without another word. Martinez stepped up beside her, his face troubled. "Hey," he said softly, "for what it's worth, good luck up there." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in weeks, and she felt something in her chest crack. "Thanks, Martinez," she replied. "You got family." "Mom back in Oregon," he said with a small nod. "Call her after this," Kira said. "Tell her you love her." The implication was clear. They both knew the odds. At exactly 6 o'clock, the convoy rolled out. 3 heavily armored MRAPs rumbled out of the gate, their engines a low roar in the early morning quiet. They had done this run dozens of times. It should have been routine. Kira sat in the middle vehicle, squeezed between crates of supplies and a young army specialist named Chen. He couldn't have been more than 20 with a baby face and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "First convoy?" she asked. Chen nodded, not trusting his voice. "Does it get easier?" he finally whispered. Kira thought about lying. She thought about giving him a comforting platitude about how the fear eventually fades. But her father had taught her better. He had taught her that lies were what got people killed in the field. "No," she said, "but you learn to manage it. You learn to function despite the fear." Chen didn't look reassured. "What if I freeze? What if I mess up and people die because of me?" The driver called back from the front before Kira could answer. "Kid, everyone freezes their first time. The trick is to unfreeze before someone shoots you." A few of the other soldiers laughed nervously, and Chen managed a weak smile. Kira didn't laugh. She was staring out the window, watching the terrain roll past. She was reading the land, analyzing every hill and gully, seeing the ambush points and kill zones with eyes she hadn't wanted to use. It was automatic now, like breathing. The drive to the relay point took 40 minutes. The ridge was accessible only by a narrow, treacherous goat path that barely accommodated the heavy MRAP. When they reached the top, Kira grabbed her gear and climbed out. The view was breathtaking. The entire valley spread out below them, a vast, desolate expanse of brown and gray. The convoy route was a thin, dark line cutting through the center, a perfect textbook ambush zone. Every instinct she possessed was screaming at her. This was wrong. The intelligence was bad, the route was compromised, and they were walking straight into a trap. But she wasn't a tactical officer. She was just a comms specialist, so she did her job. She set up the satellite dish and the relay station with practiced efficiency. Cain's voice crackled over the radio, harsh and mocking. "Ashford, comm check. Comms check good, Chief," she replied. "You're 5 by 5. Try to keep it that way," Cain snapped. "And Ashford, when the shooting starts, don't embarrass us by crying." Kira didn't respond. She just watched through her binoculars as the convoy continued its descent into the valley. The sun was fully up now, and the heat was already starting to shimmer off the rocks. By noon, it would be over 100 degrees. That kind of heat made distances waver and calculations harder. It made mistakes inevitable. The radio was filled with the mundane chatter of men on a long drive. Position reports, bad jokes, Martinez doing a terrible impression of Cain that made everyone laugh. And then the tone changed. Martinez's voice went tight and professional. "Duke, we've got something. 11 o'clock, high ground." Kira swung her binoculars toward the coordinates before her brain even fully processed the words. She saw it immediately, a flash of light, metal catching the sun. An optic. Someone was watching them. Probable scout, Martinez continued. Could be civilian, but the world exploded. The lead MRAP vanished in a massive fireball as an RPG struck its side. The sound was so loud it rattled Kira's teeth, even from hundreds of meters away. She watched in horror as the massive vehicle lurched and ground to a halt, thick black smoke pouring from the engine. Then the firing started. It didn't come from just one spot. It came from 6, 8, 10 different positions. It was a coordinated, military-grade ambush. Cain's voice erupted over the radio, the mockery gone, replaced by pure command. "Contact, multiple positions, return fire, return fire." Kira's hands moved on their own. She switched frequencies, calling back to the base. Her voice remained steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "FOB Sentinel, this is Relay Beta. Troops in contact. I repeat, troops in contact. Grid reference." Bullets began to impact the rocks around her. The distinctive crack snap of rounds passing close is a sound you never forget. They had spotted her. She was the only thing on the high ground, a perfect target. She dropped behind her equipment, trying to make herself as small as possible. A round struck the satellite dish, sending it spinning. She scrambled to stabilize it, her hands shaking but her movements precise. Without that dish, they would lose the relay, and without the relay, the SEALs were blind. Duke's voice cut through the noise. "Relay Beta, get down. We can manage without you." But they couldn't. Kira could hear the chaos on the radio. Units were losing contact, and the sheer volume of fire was pinning them down. Without the relay, they couldn't call for air support or a quick reaction force. She stayed up, one hand holding the dish steady while the other worked the radio. "FOB Sentinel, we need air support." "How copy?" The reply was buried in static. "Relay Beta, nearest birds are 45 minutes out." "Repeat, 45 minutes." Kira looked down at the valley. 45 minutes was a lifetime. The SEALs were trying to establish a defensive perimeter, but they were caught in a crossfire. The insurgents had the high ground on both sides. "Martinez, Duke, we've got to move." Cain was shouting, "We stay here, we all die here." Another explosion rocked the valley, and the rear MRAP began to smoke. Kira saw men scrambling out, dragging their wounded into the meager cover of the vehicles. That was when she saw the sniper. He was on the northern ridge, about 900 meters away, well concealed and professional. She watched through her binoculars as he fired. A SEAL spun and dropped. That was 2 men down. Kira's breathing was shallow and fast. She tried the technique her father had taught her, 1, 2, 3, 4, but it wasn't working. She grabbed her M4 and tried to aim at the northern ridge, but it was useless. At that range, she was just wasting ammo. Another SEAL went down. 3, air support. "Where is the air support?" Cain's voice was ragged. 42 minutes, Chief." Kira yelled into the radio, "We don't have 42 minutes." He screamed back, "We don't have 42 seconds." He was right. Kira could see the geometry of the battle. The insurgents were methodically closing the trap. They were going to wipe the team out before anyone could get there. Another explosion, another scream. This one was young and terrified. Chen's voice came over the radio, a high-pitched wail of agony. I'm hit bad, Mom. Mom, I can hear you." "I'm sorry." The transmission cut off in a burst of static. 6 men down. The kid who had asked if it got easier was dead, calling for his mother with his last breath. Kira felt something inside her snap. It wasn't a violent break. It was a cold, quiet realization. The promise she had made to her mother didn't matter. Her father's legacy didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the reality of the valley and the men dying in the dirt. She turned and ran. 200 meters behind her position in the back of the supply vehicle was a heavy black drag bag. She had seen it when they were unloading. She reached the vehicle, hauled the bag out, and dragged it back to her vantage point. Her hands didn't shake as she unzipped it. Inside was an M110 semi-automatic sniper system. It was a beautiful, lethal piece of machinery. 7.62 mm with a high-powered optic and a suppressed barrel. It wasn't the rifle her father had used, but it was close enough. She lay down in the dirt, the rifle fitting into her shoulder as if it were a part of her body. She dialed in the scope, her mind moving through the calculations with a speed that was almost frightening. Distance, 900 meters. Wind, 5 miles per hour from the left. Elevation, 60 meters down. She found the sniper on the northern ridge. He was lining up a shot on Duke. Kira didn't feel anything, no anger, no fear, no hesitation. She was just a machine, a biological computer designed to solve a problem. She squeezed the trigger. Through the scope, she saw the sniper's head snap back. She didn't stop to think. She swung the rifle to the left, finding a group of insurgents behind a rock outcropping. They were preparing another RPG. 2, 3, 4. The M110 barked rhythmically, the suppressor turning the reports into heavy thuds. She moved through the targets with a cold, mechanical efficiency. 5, 6, 7. Down in the valley, the pressure began to lift. The SEALs realized the fire from the northern ridge had stopped. Duke's voice came over the radio, filled with confusion. Who's firing? Who's taking out the ridgeline? Kira didn't answer. She was already tracking her next target. A machine gun team was setting up on a ledge to the south. She adjusted her aim, holding for the slight change in wind. 8, 9. The machine gun went silent. She was a ghost. She was a shadow. She was the daughter of Marcus Ashford, and she was doing the only thing she had ever been truly good at. 10, 11, 12. Each shot was a broken promise, but each shot was also a life saved. She saw Cain looking up toward her ridge, his face a mask of disbelief. He saw the muzzle flashes, saw the precision with which the enemy was being dismantled. The 18th minute arrived. Kira found the final target, the man at 1,400 meters. He was the most dangerous, the one who could still turn the tide. She took the long breath, made the impossible calculation, and fired. 14. The silence that followed was absolute. The valley was a graveyard of smoke and wreckage, but the SEALs were standing. They were moving. They were alive. Kira stayed behind the rifle for a long time, her eyes still pressed to the glass, watching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The ambush was over. She heard the footsteps again. This time she didn't wait for them to speak. She sat up, the M110 resting across her lap. Her hands were shaking now, more violently than before, but she didn't try to hide it. She looked at Duke as he reached the top of the ridge. He looked at the rifle, then at her, and finally at the valley below. "You did it," he whispered. "I broke my promise," she said, her voice cracking. Duke knelt down beside her, ignoring the stares of the other SEALs. "You saved them, Kira. You saved all of them." She looked at Cain, who was standing a few feet away. He looked like he had seen a ghost. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes told her everything. He knew now. They all knew. Kira stood up, her legs finally steady. She handed the M110 to Duke, her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm Specialist Kira Ashford," she said, her voice echoing across the silent ridge. "And I'm going home." She walked past Cain, past Martinez, and past the wreckage of her old life. She didn't look back. She knew the weight of what she had done would stay with her forever, a shadow that would never truly fade. But as the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, she realized her father had been right about one thing. There was a difference between killing and surviving. And for the first time in 6 years, she felt like she was finally alive. The silence that followed Duke's command was heavier than the sound of the explosions. It was a hollow, ringing void that seemed to swallow the heat of the Afghan sun. Kira sat frozen, the headset pressing against her ears, listening to the static of a dying frequency. She had never heard Duke sound like this. Throughout their training, through the grueling months of deployment, he had been the bedrock, a man of iron will and unshakable confidence. But now his voice was a ragged shadow of itself. It was the sound of a man who had watched his world collapse in the span of a few heartbeats, defeated, lost. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't a command. It was a plea to the universe. He asked if anyone was still alive, his voice cracking on the words "sound off." The responses came in slow, agonizing increments. One voice, then another, thin and reedy over the comms. She counted them as they flickered into existence like dying candles in a storm. 6. Only 6 voices answered the call. Out of the 13 men who had set out that morning, 7 were gone, and the 6 who remained were trapped in a killing jar, bleeding out under a merciless sky. Kira felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. She looked down at her M4 carbine, a weapon she'd been trained to use for self-defense, not for the kind of war currently unfolding in the valley below. Then her gaze shifted. 200 meters away, nestled near a jagged outcrop of rock where she had been positioned to provide relay support, lay her drag bag. It sat there, unassuming and lethal, containing the one thing she had promised herself she would never touch again. In that moment of paralysis, the past rushed in to fill the silence. She saw her mother's face, not as it had been in the happy years, but as it looked at the funeral, gray, translucent, and utterly shattered. Her mother had held Kira's hands so tightly it hurt, her eyes wild with a desperate, clawing grief. She had begged Kira for a promise. She'd made her swear she would never follow in her father's footsteps, that she would never become a phantom who dealt in the currency of distance and death. Kira had given that promise willingly, driven by her own resentment of a father who was more a legend than a man. But as the insurgent sniper's rifle barked again from the northern ridge, sending another seal into the dirt, another voice echoed in her mind. It was her father's voice, deep, resonant, and devoid of the emotion that usually clouded judgment. He hadn't asked for a promise of safety. He had told her that the only thing that mattered was doing what was right, regardless of the cost or the labels others placed upon her. The 7th man fell, and the reality of the massacre finally broke the dam inside Kira. She didn't think, she moved. The transition from a communications specialist to a predator was instantaneous, a muscle memory she had tried to drown for 6 years. She bolted from her cover, her boots pounding against the unforgiving terrain of rock and shifting sand. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and parched earth. Rounds began to kick up plumes of dust around her feet, the enemy finally noticing the lone figure sprinting across the ridge. One bullet passed so close to her neck that she felt the sudden, sharp displacement of air, a hot finger tracing a line across her skin. She didn't flinch. She didn't slow down. Her lungs screamed for oxygen in the thin mountain air, but her focus was narrowed to a single point, the heavy, familiar weight of the drag bag. She reached it, sliding into the dirt and grabbing the straps. With the bag clutched to her chest, she scrambled back to a defensible position, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Below, another explosion rocked the valley, followed by a scream that was cut short with sickening abruptness. 8 dead. The count was rising, and the window for salvation was closing. Her hands, which had been trembling only moments ago, were suddenly, unnervingly steady as she yanked the zipper of the bag. The M110 semi-automatic sniper system lay nestled in the foam, its dark metal gleaming with a cold, predatory light. It was already suppressed, the optics calibrated, a 20-round magazine sitting right where it belonged. Touching the rifle felt like coming home and descending into the deepest circle of hell at the exact same time. Duke's voice crackled over the radio again, the desperation now reaching a fever pitch. He was calling for options, for a miracle, for anything that could break the box the insurgents had built around them. Kira didn't respond. She couldn't. She was already extending the bipod, settling the rifle into the crook of her shoulder, and pulling back the bolt. The metallic clack of a round chambering was a final, definitive sound, the turning of a key in a lock she had sworn to leave rusted shut. As she pressed her eye to the scope, the world underwent a terrifying transformation. The chaos of Afghanistan, the political complexities of the war, and the heavy weight of her broken promise all vanished. The lens stripped the world of its humanity, reducing the battlefield to a series of technical problems that required immediate, violent solutions. She looked for the northern ridge first. That was where the professional was hiding, the marksman who had systematically dismantled Duke's team. She found him within seconds. He was good, well-concealed, but he wasn't Marcus Ashford's daughter. Her internal rangefinder clicked into place. 943 meters. The wind was coming from the east at 7 miles per hour, gusting to 9. She adjusted the elevation, calculated the lead, and felt her body begin to shut down everything that wasn't essential to the shot. Her breathing slowed, a rhythmic count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her heart rate plummeted, dropping from a panicked gallop to a steady glacial thrum. 40 beats per minute. 35, 30. The world narrowed until there was nothing left but the crosshairs and the space between heartbeats. Her finger moved to the trigger, applying 2 pounds of pressure, then 3. In the silence of her mind, her father's voice was crystal clear, a ghost guiding her hand. "Don't think," he whispered. "Just be." She squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a sharp, controlled kick that sent the 7.62 rounds screaming through the air. Through the high-powered optics, she watched the insurgent sniper jerk backward as if hit by an invisible sledgehammer. His weapon tumbled from his hands, and he slumped into the rocks, dead before the sound of the shot could have reached him. 1. Kira felt no surge of triumph, no wave of horror. There was only a cold, analytical clarity, a legacy she had inherited and could no longer deny. She shifted her focus immediately. The western rocks. 4 shooters were perched there, pouring suppressing fire onto the pinned seals. She acquired the first target, compensated for the slight change in wind and elevation, and fired again. 2. The remaining 3 insurgents realized the threat had shifted and began to scramble. It was a tactical reaction, but movement only made them easier to track for someone who had been drilled by the best in the world. One man made the fatal error of standing up to run for better cover. Kira led him by half a meter, her finger steady on the reset. 3. The last 2 went prone, trying to minimize their profile. It was a smart move against a standard infantryman, but against a sniper, being prone meant being predictable. It meant they were anchored to a single spot. She waited, watching through the scope as one of them shifted to adjust his sightline. That was all the opening she needed. 4. The final shooter tried to crawl away, dragging his RPK behind him. Kira tracked him with a patience that bordered on the supernatural, waiting for the perfect alignment of his spine and her crosshairs. 5. In the valley, the sudden silence from the northern ridge was deafening. Cain's voice broke through the static, filled with a mixture of confusion and shock. He wanted to know who had taken out the sniper. No one answered. The men were too busy trying to keep their heads down, unaware that the hand of God had just descended upon the ridge above them. Kira was already scanning for new signatures. Her eyes moved across the terrain the way her father had taught her, not looking for people, but for anomalies. A shadow that didn't fit, a shimmer of heat from a muzzle, a patch of clothing that was a shade too dark for the surrounding stone. Every flash was a signature, every position was a puzzle. She found the next cluster on the southern ridge, 600 meters out. 3 shooters were hammering Martinez's position, keeping him trapped behind a crumbling stone wall. She worked through them with the clinical efficiency of a machine. Center mass, breathe, squeeze, 6. The second man turned toward his fallen comrade, his face a mask of sudden terror. Too slow, 7. The third man attempted to return fire in her general direction, spraying bullets wildly at the ridgeline. She watched his muzzle flashes, calculated the angle of his concealment behind a large boulder, and adjusted her aim to account for the ricochet potential. She fired, and the shooter slumped forward. 8. Duke's voice came over the radio again, but the defeat was gone, replaced by a stunned, wary hope. He noted that the suppressing fire had stopped and asked what was happening. Martinez, ever the optimist even in the face of death, shouted that he didn't know, but he was moving for better cover. Kira watched him through the scope, her finger hovering over the trigger as she cleared his path. She saw an insurgent rise from a hidden spider hole to take a shot at Martinez's exposed back. She didn't give him the chance. 9. She swung the rifle toward the eastern slope, searching for the long-range threats. At 1,000 meters, the wind was a chaotic variable, whipping through the draws and canyons. She spotted a shooter who knew what he was doing, moving between rocky outcrops and never staying exposed for more than a second. He was a shadow in the shimmer of the heat. Kira didn't rush. Her father's lessons echoed in her ears. Patience is the sniper's greatest weapon. Rush the shot, miss the target, die stupid. She waited for the rhythm of his movement, timing the gap between his dashes. He shifted just for a heartbeat, and she sent the round home. 10. The insurgent force was beginning to fracture. The perfect ambush had turned into a slaughterhouse, and they couldn't see the butcher. Some began to retreat, making the desperate mistake of running into the open. To a trained eye, a running target was a mathematical formula. Kira calculated the lead, the drop, and the atmospheric pressure as if she were solving a simple equation. 11, 12. Another man tried to flank around the eastern side, aiming to get a high ground advantage on the seals from a new angle. She saw him long before he reached his mark. 1,300 meters. It was an extreme distance for the M110, pushing the rifle to its absolute ballistic limits. The air was dancing with a thick heat shimmer, making the target look like a ghost in a mirror. She adjusted for every variable, the angle of the slope, the spin drift of the bullet, the thinning air. She squeezed the trigger, and the insurgent dropped mid-stride, tumbling down the rocky incline. 13. The valley had gone quiet now, the frantic chatter of insurgent weapons replaced by the rhythmic, purposeful fire of the surviving SEALs as they began to mop up the remaining resistance. Cain's voice was shaken, demanding to know how many shooters were down and who was responsible. Duke didn't answer immediately. Kira could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the realization beginning to dawn. He knew who was on that ridge. He knew who he had placed there. Kira didn't let up. She swept her scope across the landscape one more time, her eyes burning from the strain of the optics. She was looking for the one threat that could still turn the tide. She found him at 1,400 meters. He was setting up a heavy machine gun on a high ledge, preparing to rain lead down on Duke's position. It was a shot that shouldn't have been possible with her current platform. The M110 wasn't designed for this kind of range. By the time the bullet reached that distance, it would be subsonic, its trajectory falling off a cliff and its stability compromised by the smallest breath of wind. She remembered her father telling her about a similar shot he'd made in Iraq. He'd called it an impossible shot, then added with that terrifying, cold smile of his, "Except I didn't believe in impossible." Kira didn't believe in it either. She held the crosshairs high, far above the target's head, compensating for a massive amount of drop. She accounted for the wind that would play havoc with the slowed round. She took the breath, felt the world go still, and squeezed. 4 seconds. That was how long the bullet stayed in the air. It felt like an eternity. She watched through the scope, her heart stopped in her chest, until the machine gunner suddenly collapsed as if his strings had been cut. 14. The valley fell into a profound, ringing silence. The only sounds left were the urgent voices of the SEALs calling out all clears and checking on their wounded. Kira stayed on the rifle. She didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. She remained the guardian on the ridge, scanning for a ghost that wasn't there. It had taken 18 minutes. 18 minutes to eliminate 14 human beings. 18 minutes to destroy the person she had spent 6 years trying to become. The sound of approaching engines finally broke her trance. Vehicles were screaming toward her position from the rear. Duke's voice crackled on the radio, calling for relay beta. He was coming for her. Kira tried to answer, but her throat had seized up. It felt like it was filled with sand. The weight of what she had done finally crashed over her like a tidal wave. 14 people. 14 lives extinguished by her hand. She thought of their families, their mourning rituals, the mundane details of their lives that were now gone forever. Her hands began to shake, a fine tremor that quickly escalated into a violent shuddering that racked her entire body. The M110, which had felt like a natural extension of her arm only minutes ago, now felt like a leaden curse, heavy with guilt and the stench of burnt powder. She heard the crunch of boots on the rock behind her. Multiple people were approaching, their movements hurried. She didn't turn around. She kept her eye pressed to the scope, staring at a patch of empty dirt because she couldn't bear to look at the men she had just saved. She heard Martinez's voice first, a whisper filled with an awe that bordered on fear. "Holy!" That was her, it was her. "Everyone stay back," Duke's voice commanded. It was quiet, calm, the voice of a man who had seen the abyss and recognized the look of someone who had just climbed out of it. "Give her space." More boots arrived. She could feel their eyes on her, could feel the collective shock of the team as they looked at the quiet, unassuming communications girl and the pile of brass shells scattered around her. They were trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the dealer of death standing before them. She stayed frozen, her finger still resting on the trigger guard in a display of perfect discipline that only added to their unease. "Is that our sniper rifle?" Cain's voice was closer now, filled with a jagged, defensive edge. "How did she—" I said stay back. Duke barked, his command voice returning with enough force to make the men recoil. "All of you give her room." But the whispers didn't stop. They drifted to her on the wind. 14 confirmed. Maybe 15 in 18 minutes. Who is she? How does a comms tech make a 1,400-meter shot with an M110? That's not possible. That's a Legends shot. Kira's finger stayed on the trigger guard. She wasn't moving until the order came. Her father had beaten that into her. "Until the mission is over, you are a part of the weapon." "Relay Beta, this is Duke," he said, standing just a few feet away. "Targets neutralized. Stand down, Kira. Stand down." The words were simple, but they were the hardest things she had ever had to obey. Taking her eye away from the scope meant returning to a world where she was a murderer. It meant facing the men whose lives she had bought with the blood of others. She slowly let out a breath and pulled back from the rifle. The transition was jarring. The bright Afghan sun felt like a physical blow to her eyes. She turned slowly, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She saw them then, the survivors. Martinez, whose cocky grin had been replaced by a look of profound reverence. Cain, looking pale and sick, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the rifle and then at her. 6 men who should have been dead were standing there, looking at her as if she were a ghost. Cain was the first to find his voice, though it sounded strangled. "Who the hell are you?" Kira stood up, her entire body trembling. She looked at the M110, still warm, the scent of carbon clinging to her skin. She looked at Duke, who was watching her with an expression that was a painful mix of pride and deep, abiding sadness. He had known. Maybe not the extent of it, but he had known there was a wolf hiding in the sheep's clothing. She thought about her mother's promise, now a jagged shard in her heart. She thought about the SEAL named Chen, who had died calling for his mother. She thought about the 14 men in the valley who would never go home. "I'm Specialist Kira Ashford," she said, her voice small but clear. "Communications." The words felt like a lie the moment they left her lips. The air around them seemed to vibrate with the absurdity of the statement. Cain shook his head, his face twisting in a mix of anger and disbelief. "No, no way, those shots. That was professional work, that was master level, you're not. You can't be just comms." "Let it go, Chief," Duke warned, but Cain was spiraling. The reality that he had treated her like an unwanted burden, that he had positioned her on this ridge hoping she would fail and quit, was clearly eating him alive. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Cain demanded, stepping closer. "Nobody just picks up a rifle and does that. Where?" Kira looked down at the rifle again. It was the source of her salvation and her damnation. "My father taught me," she whispered. "Your father?" Martinez asked, his voice soft. "Who was he? What unit?" Duke stepped between them, his large frame shielding Kira from their interrogation. "That's enough. She saved your lives. Every single one of you would be a corpse in that valley if she hadn't been here. That is all the information you are entitled to." "The hell it is." Cain's voice rose, the shock finally turning into a defensive rage. "I put her up here to fail. I wanted her gone because I thought she was a liability, and instead she—" He stopped, the weight of his own admission hitting him. The other SEALs were staring at him now, their expressions hardening. Martinez's voice was like ice. "You put her up here to fail, you set her up to die while we were down there." "I didn't think," Cain started, but Duke cut him off with a look that could have peeled paint. "No, you didn't think, Chief. You let your ego and your prejudice cloud your judgment, and you nearly cost 13 men their lives. If Kira hadn't made the choice she made, if she hadn't been exactly who she is, we'd be waiting for the body bags right now." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ridge. Martinez looked back at Kira, his eyes wide. 14 targets in 18 minutes. I've seen some things, but that's sniper school legend stuff. "Who trained you, Kira? Truly?" Before she could answer, an older SEAL named Thompson, a man who had been in the special operations community longer than most of them had been alive, went very still. He looked at Kira's face, really looked at it, and then he looked at the way she held herself even in her state of shock. "Ashford," he murmured. "Marcus Ashford." The name hit the group like a physical shock wave. In the world of special operations, Marcus Ashford wasn't just a name, he was the ghost, a man whose exploits were whispered about in dark corners of bars and briefed in hushed tones at JSOC. He was the gold standard of lethality, a man who had moved through the shadows of the world's most dangerous places and left nothing but silence in his wake. "The ghost," Thompson whispered, his voice thick with awe. "You're the ghost's daughter." The silence that followed was absolute. The resentment, the confusion, and the anger all evaporated, replaced by a singular, chilling realization. They weren't standing with a communications specialist. They were standing with the progeny of a legend. Martinez whistled low, a sound of pure amazement. "The ghost trained you personally. That's why. That's why you could make that 1,400-meter shot." Kira couldn't speak. She just nodded, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. Cain looked like he had been struck by lightning. The man he had bullied and dismissed was the daughter of the most feared sniper in modern history. "You've been pretending," he said, his voice bitter. "You've been playing a game with us." "I wasn't pretending," Kira said, her voice regaining its strength. "I am a communications specialist. I chose this. I wanted a life where I didn't have to look through a scope. I wanted to be someone who helped people talk, not someone who stopped them from breathing." "Then why hide it?" Thompson asked. He wasn't accusing her, he was genuinely curious. Skill like that, it's a gift, why bury it? Because I saw what it did to him, Kira snapped, the words pouring out of her. I watched my father become a ghost long before he actually died. I watched him lose his humanity piece by piece until he couldn't look at a person without seeing a target. I didn't want that life. I promised my mother I would never be that. And yet here you are, Cain said, his voice a jagged edge of cruelty. 14 kills just like him. The words were a knife in her gut. Kira felt something inside her break, a final structural failure of the identity she had spent years building. Duke saw it happen and stepped toward Cain, his hand hovering near his sidearm. Chief, that is the last word you will say on this matter. She saved us. She chose to break her own heart to keep us alive. You will show her the respect she earned, or so help me, you won't like what happens next. Cain backed down, but the damage was done. The label had been applied. The ghost's daughter was no longer a secret. Kira looked at the horizon, her vision blurring. She felt the weight of the 14 souls she had taken, and she knew they would never leave her. She had become the thing she feared most, and there was no going back. I just want to go home, she whispered, so softly that only Duke heard her. Soon, he promised, his voice low and protective. But first, we have to get our brothers out of that valley. We have to bring the dead home. The dead. The reality of the loss hit them all over again. 7 men were gone. 7 families were about to receive a knock on the door that would change their lives forever. But as the grief settled in, so did a cold, hard logic. Kira's mind, trained by a man who saw the world in patterns and probabilities, began to click into gear. She looked at Duke, her eyes narrowing. Duke, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a random patrol bumping into an insurgent cell. Duke nodded grimly. I know, the positions, the timing. They were waiting for us. They knew exactly which route we were taking and when we would be in the kill zone. Which means we have a leak, Kira said, the realization chilling her more than the killing had. Someone at the FOB gave us up. The implications were devastating. If the insurgents had known about their movement, they likely knew much more. They were in a nest of vipers, and they didn't know which one was waiting to strike next. The team stood in a circle, the camaraderie that usually defined them replaced by a sharp, jagged suspicion. We need to lock down the base, Cain said, his voice returning to a more professional tone. We need to find out who. We don't know who to trust, Thompson interrupted. It could be anyone, a local contractor, a disgruntled staff officer, even someone in our own chain of command. Duke looked at Kira, his expression turning grave. Kira, when we get back, you say nothing, to anyone. As far as the official record is concerned, you were providing calm support and stayed in your position. The insurgent force broke contact after taking heavy casualties from the team's return fire. But that's a lie, Kira said. They'll see the bodies. They'll see the precision of the shots. Let them wonder, Duke insisted. If the traitor knows we have someone with your capabilities on this team, you become the primary target. You're our ace in the hole, Kira. As long as they think you're just the comms girl, you're safe. And more importantly, you're the one who can catch them off guard again. Kira understood the logic, but it felt like another layer of deception added to a life already built on shadows. She looked at the M110, then at the drag bag. She began to break the rifle down with a speed and fluidity that silenced the men once more. It was a ritual of concealment. She tucked the rifle back into its foam nest, zipped the bag, and stood up. The sound of the medevac helicopters grew louder, a thumping rhythm that signaled the end of the battle and the beginning of the aftermath. The SEALs began to move, preparing the area for the extraction. Martinez paused as he passed her, reaching out to squeeze her shoulder. For what it's worth, Specialist, I don't care who your father was. I care that you're here. Thank you. Kira watched him walk away. She felt the weight of the bag in her hand and the weight of the secrets in her head. She was Kira Ashford, a communications specialist who had just killed 14 men. She was the daughter of a ghost, and she was the only one who could see the shadows closing in. As the helicopters touched down and the dust began to swirl, she realized that the war she had tried to run from hadn't just found her. It had claimed her, and she would do whatever it took to make sure no more of her brothers ended up in the dirt, even if it meant becoming the very thing she had promised her mother she would never be. The quiet girl with the headset was gone. In her place stood a predator, waiting for the next target to reveal itself in the dark. The silence that followed Martinez's departure was more deafening than the roar of the firefight had been. Kira stood alone on the jagged limestone ridge, the high-altitude wind whipping through her hair and tugging at the loose fabric of her uniform. In her hands, The M110 felt like a natural extension of her own body, its weight familiar and haunting. Below her, in the valley that had nearly become a graveyard, the smoke from the charred remains of the convoy rose in lazy black plumes, smudging the pristine blue of the Afghan sky. She could see the survivors, men she had known for weeks but never truly belonged with, moving like ghosts among the wreckage. She had saved them. There was no questioning that reality. If she hadn't picked up that rifle, if she hadn't channeled every ounce of the lethal inheritance she had spent years trying to suppress, they would be nothing more than cooling corpses in the dirt. But the cost of that salvation was a heavy, jagged thing sitting in the pit of her stomach. She had broken the one promise that mattered. She had become exactly what her father, Marcus Ashford, had spent a lifetime being. And the most terrifying part wasn't the 14 lives she had just snuffed out with surgical precision. It was the tiny, dark corner of her soul that whispered it felt right. That whisper scared her more than the prospect of an insurgent bullet ever could. The horizon began to thrum with a low-frequency vibration that rattled the very air in her lungs. The rescue helicopters were approaching, appearing first as tiny glints of silver against the mountain peaks, before resolving into the bulky, predatory shapes of Black Hawks. They brought with them a storm of dust and noise, the rotor wash kicking up a cloud of grit that forced Kira to squint. As they touched down in the valley floor, the transition from combat to recovery began with frantic, practiced efficiency. Medics spilled out of the side doors, their bags heavy with life-saving equipment, running toward the wounded. Kira watched it all from her lonely height, still clutching the MEU/SOC 1911 sidearm she had transitioned to after the long rifle had done its work. Her fingers were locked around the grip, her knuckles white, her body refusing to acknowledge that the immediate danger had passed. Duke appeared at the edge of her vision, climbing back up to the ridge with the heavy, methodical gait of a man who had left a piece of his soul down in that kill box. His face was a mask of grime, sweat, and grim determination. He didn't look at the valley, he looked at her. He saw the way she held the weapon, the way her eyes scanned the perimeter even now, looking for the next threat before it could materialize. He knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of the most dangerous men in the world. He reached her side and stood for a moment, letting the noise of the idling helicopters wash over them. "We need to move," he said, his voice barely audible over the mechanical roar. "Pack up your comm equipment. We're evacuating the ridge." Kira didn't respond immediately. She just nodded, a sharp, jerky movement, and finally forced her fingers to uncurl from the pistol. Setting the weapon down felt like losing a limb. The sudden emptiness in her hands felt wrong, as if she were stepping out into a storm without a coat. She turned her back on the valley and began the mechanical process of breaking down the satellite relay. She coiled the thick, black cables with a focus that bordered on obsessive, clicking the latches on the transport cases with a rhythmic finality. These were safe tasks, normal tasks. They didn't require her to think about the windage, the elevation, or the way a human head looked through a high-powered optic at 500 meters. Duke stayed with her, his movements efficient as he helped her secure the gear. He was being quiet, too quiet, and she knew he was processing the impossibility of what he had witnessed. He had seen her take shots that even the most seasoned SEAL snipers would have hesitated to attempt. He knew who her father was now, even if the words hadn't been spoken aloud between them yet. "Kira," he said, pausing as they lifted the final case. "You okay?" She didn't look at him. "No," she replied. It was the only honest answer she had. "Fair enough," Duke said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Listen to me. When we get back to FOB Sentinel, things are going to move fast. There's going to be a frenzy. Debriefs, investigations, guys from JAG and Intel crawling all over us. I need you to trust me." Kira finally looked up, her eyes hard. "What are you planning, Duke?" "Damage control," he said, his jaw tightening. "The fewer people who know exactly what you're capable of, the safer you'll be. Especially now. We have a traitor on that base, Kira. Someone gave up our route. Someone wanted us dead. If they find out we have a tactical asset like you hidden in the comms shack, you become the biggest target in the theater." The walk down to the valley floor was a blur of sensory overload. The smell of copper and diesel was thick in the air. Kira found herself being ushered into the cramped, vibrating belly of a Black Hawk, sitting directly across from Cain. The big man was pale, his shoulder heavily bandaged where a round had grazed him, but his eyes were wide and fixed on Kira. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. To him, she was no longer the quiet girl who sat in the corner of the mess hall with a book. She was a ghost, a lethal enigma that had appeared out of nowhere to save his life. The flight back to the base took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. The interior of the helicopter was a symphony of groans from the wounded and the relentless, rhythmic thumping of the rotors. Every person in that bird was weighed down by the events of the afternoon, the silence thick and suffocating. Martinez sat next to her, his usual cocky, self-assured demeanor replaced by a hollow-eyed stare. He leaned toward her, his voice barely a whisper under the noise. "Hey," he said, "you holding up?" Kira looked at the floor of the helicopter, at the spent brass casings rolling back and forth with the motion of the flight. "Define holding up," she muttered. Martinez let out a short, dry breath that might have been a laugh in any other circumstance. Fair point, he conceded. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the rugged terrain of the Hindu Kush pass beneath them through the open bay door. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For how I treated you, how we all treated you. You were just the comms girl to us. We didn't see you." Kira felt a lump form in her throat, one she fought to swallow. "You didn't know," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It doesn't make it right," Martinez countered. He hesitated, looking as though he were weighing his next words. "Can I ask you something? Why didn't you tell anyone? Why hide it? You could have been a legend. You could have had your pick of any unit in the service." Kira looked out the window at the jagged peaks, the mountains that looked like the teeth of some great sleeping beast. "Because the day I tell people I'm Marcus Ashford's daughter is the day I stop being Kira," she said, her voice filled with a weary conviction. "I become his legacy. I become his shadow. I spent my whole life watching what that did to him, watching how the world looked at him like he was a tool rather than a man. I just wanted to be my own person." Martinez shook his head slowly. "You are your own person, Kira. What you did today, that wasn't your father pulling the trigger. That was you. You made a choice he never had to make. He was a professional sniper. It was his job to be there. You're a soldier who picked up a rifle because your friends were dying. Is there really a difference?" Kira looked at him, her gaze piercing. "I don't know," she said. "I honestly don't know." Martinez gave her a sad, knowing smile. "Yeah, there is," he said. "You just can't see it yet." The helicopter flared for landing at FOB Sentinel, the skids hitting the helipad with a jarring thud that sent a shockwave through Kira's spine. The doors slid open, and the base erupted into a chaotic dance of urgency. Medics and orderlies rushed forward with stretchers, shouting over the whine of the engines as they unloaded the wounded. Duke jumped out first, but he stopped and grabbed Kira's arm as she moved to follow the line of soldiers. His grip was firm, a silent command for her to stay put for a second. "Remember what I told you," he said, his eyes burning with intensity. "You maintain communications. That is your role. You stayed at your post, you kept the relay open, and you did your job. You did not see what happened in the valley floor from a tactical perspective. You were busy with the equipment." "Understood." Kira glanced toward the equipment cases being unloaded. "What about the M110? She asked. "People are going to notice it was fired. The round count won't match the logs." "Let me worry about the hardware," Duke snapped, though his tone wasn't unkind. "Right now I need you to be the invisible specialist, the one who doesn't cause problems, the one who doesn't have a story to tell. Can you do that?" Kira nodded, though every fiber of her being was screaming against the lie. She wanted to scream the truth until her lungs burned. She wanted someone to tell her that she wasn't a monster, or perhaps she wanted someone to punish her for how easy it had been to kill. But Duke was right. The air at FOB Sentinel was thick with suspicion. There was a wolf in the fold, and until they found out who had sold them out, being invisible was her only armor. Walking through the base felt like moving through a dream. Word of the ambush had preceded them, and the atmosphere was electric with grief and anger. 7 men were dead. That was nearly half the convoy. It was the worst loss the base had sustained in a single engagement in years. People rushed past Kira, their faces tight with stress, none of them sparing a glance for the dusty communications tech. She was a ghost in her own life. She made it back to her small, cramped quarters, a tiny room that smelled of stale air and industrial cleaner. She shut the door, leaned her back against the metal, and finally allowed the dam to break. Her hands began to shake, then her arms, until her entire body was convulsing with the delayed shock of the adrenaline crash. The weight of those 14 lives descended on her all at once, a crushing physical pressure that forced her to slide down the door until she was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest. She pulled out her phone, knowing there was no signal in this sector of the base, but she didn't need a signal. She opened her drafts and scrolled to a letter she had written months ago, a letter to her mother that she had never found the courage to send. "Mom, I'm okay," it read. "The work is boring, mostly just fixing radios and staring at monitors, but I'm safe. You don't have to worry about me. I'm not like Dad. I'll never be like Dad. I promise." Her thumb hovered over the delete button. Every word was a lie now. She wasn't safe, she wasn't bored, and the promise she had made was shattered into 1,000 pieces. A sharp, rhythmic knocking at the door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. "Ashford, you in there?" It was Thompson's voice, the veteran SEAL who had seen more combat than some countries. Kira wiped her eyes, took a ragged breath, and stood up, smoothing her uniform as best she could. She opened the door to find Thompson standing there, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a man in civilian tactical gear, khakis, a polo shirt, and a look of cold, analytical detachment that made the hair on the back of Kira's neck stand up. "This is John Rains," Thompson said, his voice unusually formal. "He's with intelligence. He wants to talk to you about the engagement today." Kira felt her blood run cold. "I already gave my initial report to Commander Brennan," she said, her voice sounding small even to her own ears. Rains stepped forward, a thin, mirthless smile touching his lips. "I'm sure you did, Specialist. But I'd like to hear the details from you directly. Mind if I come in?" He didn't wait for an answer, stepping past her into the small room. His eyes swept the space in a matter of seconds, cataloging everything from the books on her nightstand to the way her boots were lined up. It was a predatory gaze, the look of a man who looked for weaknesses as a hobby. Thompson didn't come inside. He stayed in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'll leave you to it," he said, and closed the door. Rains didn't sit down. He remained standing, using his height to dominate the small room. "Hell of a day," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "Yes, sir," Kira replied, sitting on the edge of her bunk to steady her trembling legs. "7 dead," Rains continued, his voice dropping an octave. "That's going to raise a lot of questions back at the Pentagon. There will be an inquiry, possibly a congressional hearing, given the nature of the leak. Commander Brennan tells me you were a rock out there, maintained the satellite uplink even while the ridge was taking indirect fire, stayed at your post the whole time." "I did my job, sir," Kira said, keeping her eyes fixed on a point on the wall just behind his head. Rains nodded slowly, pacing the length of the tiny room. "Brave. Most people would have gone to ground the moment the first RPG hit. Most people aren't communications specialists, sir," she countered. "The team needed that relay. If the link went down, they were dead." "That's a very selfless way of looking at it," Rains said. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, pulling out a small tablet and tapping the screen. "But here's where the story gets interesting. We've been processing the scene. We have 14 hostile casualties scattered across the western slope and the northern ridgeline. All of them were killed by long-range, precision fire. One shot, one kill, every single one." Kira's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she kept her face a mask of neutral indifference. Her father had taught her that, in an interrogation, your face is your first line of defense. "The team had a sniper rifle with them," she said. "They did," Rains agreed. "An M110, standard loadout. The thing is, we recovered that rifle. Forensics are going to tell us exactly how many rounds were fired from it. They're going to tell us the ballistic trajectory of every bullet, and they're going to tell us who was holding it." He leaned in closer, the smell of burnt coffee and peppermint on his breath. "You're good, Ashford, I'll give you that. Most people would have cracked or started bragging by now. But you've got training, real training. The kind you don't get in advanced individual training or even at the sniper school at Fort Benning." "I don't know what you mean, sir," she said, her voice a whisper. Rains snorted, a sharp, derisive sound. "Don't you? See, I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what professional work looks like. And those 14 kills. That was the work of a master. Someone who knows how to account for the Coriolis effect, the density, altitude, the thermals coming off those rocks. Someone like Marcus Ashford." Kira felt the world tilt. Rains knew. He didn't just suspect, he knew who she was. He sat down on the small chair by her desk, leaning forward until he was in her personal space. "I know who your father was, Kira. I know why he disappeared from the grid. And I know what he did for those 10 years he was retired. He was training you, wasn't he? He was building a masterpiece." Kira didn't blink. "I maintained communications, sir," she repeated. "That is all." Rains studied her for a long, agonizing minute. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of things unsaid. Finally, he stood up and walked to the door. "You know what I think, Specialist? I think you're hiding a lot more than just a talent for shooting. I think you're a liability we haven't accounted for yet. And I am very, very good at finding things people want to hide. He opened the door and stepped out into the hall. We'll talk again soon. Very soon. As soon as the door clicked shut, Kira lunged for her jacket. She couldn't stay there. She needed to see Duke. She practically ran through the corridors of the base, her mind a whirlwind of panic and fury. She found Duke in his office, the lights dimmed, the air thick with the smell of old tobacco. He was surrounded by a sea of paperwork, maps, and casualty reports. He looked like he had aged a decade in the few hours since they had landed. "Rains just interrogated me," she said, not bothering to knock. Duke's head snapped up, his eyes bloodshot. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," she replied, pacing the small office. "But he knows, Duke. He knows about my father. He knows about the shots. He's going to keep digging until he finds a way to use me." Duke rubbed his face with his hands, a gesture of pure exhaustion. Let him dig. Without a witness or a confession, he's just fishing. "He doesn't have the rifle yet. I've got it locked in my personal arms locker." "The rifle is proof," Kira hissed. "Forensics will show 14 rounds fired and 14 hits. That's not luck, and it's not the work of a SEAL team pinned down in a trench." Duke sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'm working on that. Thompson is already on record saying he made some of those shots before he was suppressed. Martinez is backing him up. They're lying for me," Kira said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "They're protecting their teammate," Duke corrected her. "There's a difference." He stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the darkened base. "Look, Kira, you need to understand the reality of your situation. What you did today saved the lives of 6 American sailors. That makes you a hero. But it also makes you a commodity. Valuable people attract the kind of attention we can't afford right now, especially with a traitor in our midst. If the higher-ups find out what you can do, your life as you know it is over. They'll pull you out of comms, they'll put you in a black program, and they'll use you until there's nothing left. Is that what you want?" "No," she said, her voice small. "Then we stay the course. You do your job, you stay quiet, let me handle reins." He turned to face her, his expression grim. "But you need to prepare yourself. This might not stay buried. What happens if it doesn't?" she asked. Duke's eyes were cold. "Then you become what your father was, a weapon owned by the state. You'll be transferred, retrained, and deployed on missions that don't exist, to kill people whose names you'll never know. Your life won't be your own anymore." The weight of his words felt like hammer blows. He was right. She had crossed a line in that valley, and there was no going back. Even if the military never found out, even if she successfully hid from the world, she would always know what she was capable of. She would always feel the ghost of that trigger pull in her finger. "There has to be another way," she whispered. "Maybe," Duke said. "But right now, our priority is the traitor. That's the only way we secure your safety. If we find the leak, we can bargain." He pulled out a thick file and spread the contents across his desk. "I've been going through personnel records for the last 3 hours, looking for anyone with the clearance and the opportunity to see that convoy route." Kira stepped closer, looking at the names and faces of the people she worked with every day. "How many people knew?" she asked. "Too many," Duke admitted. "The route was finalized 72 hours ago. It was available to command, logistics, intelligence, and even the motor pool. That's half the base," Kira said, her heart sinking, "which is why we're looking for a pattern, not a single event." They spent the next hour in a feverish search, cross-referencing previous mission reports with personnel schedules. Kira's mind, trained by her father to see patterns in terrain and wind, began to see the same thing in the data. Her father hadn't just taught her how to shoot, he had taught her how to read the world, to look for the anomaly, the thing that shouldn't be there. "What if we're looking at this wrong?" she said suddenly. Duke looked up from a logistics manifest. "What do you mean?" "The ambush was too perfect," Kira explained, her finger tracing the map of the valley. "It wasn't just a lucky hit. They knew our timing, our vehicle composition, and they knew exactly where we would place the communications relay. That kind of intelligence doesn't come from a one-time leak. It comes from someone who has been feeding them a steady stream of data for months." Duke went very still, his eyes narrowing. "You're saying this has happened before?" "I'm saying someone has been setting us up for a long time," Kira said. "Look at these reports. 2 months ago, a convoy took fire 3 miles off its route. A month ago, a patrol was hit at a changeover point. These weren't major engagements, just harassment, but they were testing us. They were learning our patterns, and they were getting that info from the same source." Duke grabbed his laptop and began pulling up more files, his fingers flying across the keys. "If you're right, there should be a signature, a common denominator in all these incidents." They dove into the data, the minutes ticking by as the base outside grew quiet. Slowly, a terrifying picture began to emerge. Every time a mission had been compromised, The same group of local contractors had been on site or in the vicinity. But it went deeper than that. The communications logs showed encrypted bursts of data leaving the base during periods of low activity, data that shouldn't have existed. Someone's been feeding them everything, Duke said, his voice a low growl. And they're still here, still watching us. Kira felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. Duke, what if Rains is part of it? What if he's not just investigating me, but trying to see how much I know? Duke's expression went hard. Then we're in more trouble than I thought, but we can't assume that without proof. We need to. A frantic pounding on the door cut him off. Martinez burst into the room, his face pale and eyes wide. Duke, we've got a problem, a big one. Duke stood up, his hand reflexively going to his sidearm. What is it? It's Cain, Martinez said, catching his breath. He's in the mess hall. He's drunk, Duke, drunk and talking. He's telling everyone what happened on that ridge. He's telling them about Kira. Duke swore, a string of profanity that would have made a sailor blush. How many people? I don't know, Martinez said. A dozen, maybe more. He's angry, Duke. He's saying she's a plant, a ghost daughter sent to spy on us. He's losing his mind. This was the nightmare scenario. The secret was out, and once it was in the air of a base like FOB Sentinel, there was no catching it. Duke grabbed his radio. All team leaders report to my office immediately. This is a code red. Within 5 minutes, the small office was packed with the surviving members of the team. Thompson was there looking like he wanted to break something. Martinez stood by the door, and Cain was shoved into the center of the room by 2 other SEALs. He smelled like cheap whiskey, and his eyes were bloodshot and defiant. Chief, you've been talking out of turn, Duke said, his voice so quiet it was more threatening than a scream. I'm talking the truth. Cain shouted, his voice slurred but loud. Everyone deserves to know. We've got a ringer in the comms shack. The Ashford girl. She killed 14 hostiles like she was picking off tin cans. That's not something you hide from your team. That's exactly what you hide when there's a traitor on base, you idiot. Duke slammed his hand on the desk, the sound like a gunshot. You just painted a giant target on her back. Do you have any idea what you've done? Cain laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. Good. Maybe now Command will see what she really is. A liar. Just like her old man, Kira felt something snap inside her. The fear, the guilt, the exhaustion, it all condensed into a white-hot spark of rage. She stepped forward, moving with a fluid speed that surprised everyone in the room. She got right in Cain's face, ignoring the fact that he was nearly twice her size. My father was a lot of things, Chief, she said, her voice vibrating with a cold, controlled fury. But he was never a liar. He was exactly what he appeared to be. A killer. He was cold, he was precise, and he did terrible things because he believed they were necessary. She leaned in closer, her eyes locked on his. I'm the liar. I'm the one who pretended I could be normal. I'm the one who thought I could hide from the blood in my veins. And you know what today proved? I can't. I am exactly what he made me, and that terrifies me more than you could ever possibly understand. But don't you ever compare him to a coward like you. He never would have put his team at risk because his ego was bruised. The room fell into a stunned silence. Cain stepped back, the defiance draining out of him, replaced by a flickering of shame. Before anyone could speak, Duke's radio crackled to life. Commander Brennan, this is Gate Security. We have a situation. Someone just tried to leave the base through the north gate without authorization. We stopped them, but they are demanding to speak with command. Who is it? Duke asked, his eyes meeting Kira's. It's Rashid, the interpreter, the radio replied. He's claiming he has a family emergency in the village. Kira and Duke didn't need to say a word. Rashid had been with them for 3 months. He had access to everything. He was the bridge between the base and the local population. Detain him, Duke ordered. I'm on my way. They reached the gate in record time. Rashid was being held by 2 MPs, his hands zip-tied behind his back. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. He was a middle-aged man, someone Kira had shared tea with only a week ago. Going somewhere, Rashid. Duke asked, his voice dripping with ice. I must go, the man stammered. My mother, she is very ill. I must be with her. Funny timing, Duke said, right after a convoy gets decimated. I know nothing of this, Rashid cried. I am a loyal worker. Really, Duke said, stepping into the man's space, because that ambush was a masterpiece of intelligence. The kind of intelligence only someone who sits in on our briefings would have. Search him. The MPs didn't find much at first, a wallet, some local currency, a set of keys. But then, tucked into the lining of his jacket, they found a small, cheap burner phone. Duke took it, his face darkening as he scrolled through the messages. His hands began to shake, not from fear, but from a towering, righteous rage. What is it? Kira asked, stepping forward. Duke turned the screen toward her. The messages were in English, short and clinical. Convoy route confirmed. 3 vehicles. Communications specialist on ridge position. Eliminate her first. The world seemed to go silent for Kira. The wind, the idling engines, the shouting of the guards, it all faded away until there was only the cold, hard reality of those words. Eliminate her first. The ambush hadn't just been a move against the SEALs. It had been a targeted hit. They knew she was there. They knew what she was. They knew she whispered, her voice barely a breath. They knew I'd be up there. Duke grabbed Rashid by the collar, hoisting him off his feet. Who told you to target her? Who gave you the order to kill Specialist Ashford? Rashid didn't look afraid anymore. He looked at Kira and a slow, sickening smile spread across his face. You think I am the only one? He spat. You think this ends with me? They know about her now. The ghost's daughter is here. They know what she can do. They know what she is. And they will not stop until she is dead. Duke shook him violently. Give me names. Who are the others? Names? Rashid laughed, a wet, rattling sound. Check your own house, American. Check your own command. The corruption goes deeper than your shallow graves. The MPs dragged him away, but his laughter echoed in the night air long after he was gone. Kira felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. If Rashid was telling the truth, if the leak was higher up, then no one on the base was safe. Least of all her. Duke turned to Martinez and Thompson. We need to move. Now, Kira, go to your quarters and pack your gear. You're getting out of here tonight. What? Kira asked, her mind racing. Where? Anywhere but here, Duke said. I'll arrange a transport to Bagram, get you on a flight stateside. You can disappear. Change your name again. Go somewhere they can't find you. I can't just run, Duke. You can and you will, he shouted. That message said eliminate her first. They want you dead, Kira. And now that Cain's been running his mouth, every insurgent within 50 miles knows there's a high-value target on this base. You're not a soldier right now. You're a lightning rod. Kira looked at the gate, then back at the darkened barracks. Everything she had done for the last 3 years had been about hiding. She had tried to be a ghost, tried to be invisible, tried to be anyone but the daughter of Marcus Ashford. But the world wouldn't let her. It had dragged her back into the light, and now it was trying to kill her for it. No, she said, her voice growing steady, a strange, cold calm settling over her. Duke blinked. What? I'm not running, she repeated. You said the corruption goes deep. If I run, they'll just find me later. They'll catch me when I'm not expecting it. They'll catch me when I don't have a rifle in my hand. So what do you suggest? Duke asked, his frustration evident. Kira looked at the mountains, the dark, jagged peaks that had seen so much blood over the centuries. She thought about her father, about the way he had lived his life, always on the offensive, always moving toward the threat rather than away from it. He had been a monster, yes, but he had been a monster who survived. We use me as bait, she said. The room went silent. Martinez looked at her like she had lost her mind. You want to deliberately put a target on yourself? The target is already there, Martinez. Might as well use it to our advantage. If they think I'm leaving, if they think I'm vulnerable, they'll come for me. And when they do, we find out who's really pulling the strings. Duke studied her for a long time. He saw the shift in her eyes, the way the comms girl had finally vanished, replaced by something much older and much more dangerous. He saw the legacy of Marcus Ashford standing in front of him, and for the first time he realized that she wasn't just a victim of her heritage, she was the master of it. Your father would be proud of you, he said softly. Kira didn't smile. My father would tell me I'm being tactically reckless, she countered. True, Duke admitted, but he'd also respect the hell out of it. He pulled out his radio and keyed the command channel. All right. If we're doing this, we do it right. We do it smart. Martinez, Thompson, gather the rest of the team. We're going hunting. The plan was hashed out in the dark confines of Duke's office over the next 2 hours. It was a simple, brutal piece of deception. They would leak word through the local staff that Kira was being transferred to Bagram at dawn. They would prepare a 2-vehicle convoy with minimal security, just enough to look like a standard administrative move, but vulnerable enough to be an irresistible target. But Kira wouldn't be in the lead vehicle. She wouldn't be in the convoy at all. She would be positioned on the high ground overlooking the most likely ambush point, the Screaming Pass, 5 miles from the base. She would have the M110, and she would have the team in overwatch. They would wait for the traitor to make their move. Martinez was the most vocal critic of the plan. It's too dangerous, he argued. If the leak is as deep as Rashid said, they'll see through this. They'll know it's a trap. Let them, Thompson said from the corner, his eyes fixed on the map. Let them think they're smarter than us. That's when people make mistakes. That's when they get sloppy. Kira stood by the window, watching the first hints of gray light begin to bleed into the eastern sky. She felt a strange sense of peace, a clarity she hadn't known her entire adult life. She was no longer fighting against herself. The internal war was over. She knew what she was now. She was a weapon, and for the first time, she was the one who was going to choose how she was used. As they began to gear up, Cain approached her. He looked sober now, and the arrogance had been completely wiped from his face. He stopped a few feet away, awkwardly twisting his helmet in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "for what I said, for what I did." Kira looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a bully or a rival. She saw a man who was terrified of a world he didn't understand. "It's okay, Cain," she said. "Just make sure you're ready when the shooting starts." He nodded, a sharp, serious movement. "I'll be there. We'll all be there." The team moved out in the pre-dawn darkness, slipping out of the base through a side gate that wasn't monitored by the main security cameras. They moved like shadows through the rocky terrain, Kira leading the way. Her father's voice was a constant companion in her mind, a rhythmic cadence that guided her footsteps. "Check your footing, watch the skyline, feel the wind." She moved with a grace and silence that even the SEALs struggled to match. They reached the screaming pass an hour before the decoy convoy was scheduled to depart. It was a perfect kill box, a narrow ribbon of road flanked by steep, crumbling cliffs. Kira chose her position with care, a small depression behind a cluster of boulders that gave her a clear view of the entire pass but left her invisible from the road below. She set up the M110, clicking the bipod into place and adjusting her scope. The world narrowed down to the crosshairs. She checked her range, her windage, and her elevation. She was ready. Duke's voice came over her earpiece, a soft, reassuring crackle. "We're in position, Kira. We've got your back. Just wait for the signal." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She just breathed, the slow, rhythmic breath of a predator waiting for its prey. In that moment, she wasn't Kira Ashford, the communications specialist. She wasn't Marcus Ashford's daughter. She was something else entirely. She was the storm that was about to break over the heads of the men who thought they could hunt her. And as the sun began to rise over the mountains, casting long, bloody shadows across the pass, she knew that whatever happened today, she would never be invisible again. The ghost had come home, and she was bringing the fire with her. The silence that followed their conversation in the dimly lit office felt heavier than the roar of the battlefield. Duke's eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had carried the weight of 100 lives on his shoulders for too long. He looked at Kira, really looked at her, searching for the girl who had arrived weeks ago with nothing but a headset and a talent for numbers. He didn't find her. Instead, he saw the reflected steel of a soldier who had found her purpose in the most violent way possible. He apologized for putting her on that ridge, his voice thick with a guilt that he couldn't quite shake. Kira met his gaze without blinking. She told him not to be sorry. He had put her exactly where she needed to be, in the one spot where she could do the most good, even if neither of them had known it at the time. Duke argued that it still didn't make it right, but Kira countered with a cold, pragmatic truth that chilled him. It made her useful, she said, and in a place where the dirt was soaked in the blood of good men, being useful was the only thing she cared about. The meeting broke up at midnight, leaving the air in the room stale and tasting of bitter coffee and regret. Kira walked back to her quarters, her boots crunching on the gravel of the compound. She was physically spent, her muscles aching from the tension of the day, yet sleep felt like a distant, impossible country. Every time she closed her eyes, the world narrowed back down to the glass of her scope. She saw the crosshairs. She felt the rhythmic, shallow breathing in the space between heartbeats, 14 shots, 14 kills. The weight of the M110 was still a phantom pressure against her shoulder. She remembered the way it had felt, not horrific, not monstrous, but right. It felt like a puzzle piece finally clicking into a slot she had spent her whole life trying to ignore. She reached her small, utilitarian room and sat on the edge of her cot, the darkness pressing in. Then her phone buzzed. In a place where signals were as rare as a cool breeze, the sudden vibration was jarring. It was a message from a number she didn't recognize, a string of digits that meant nothing. The words on the screen, however, meant everything. "We know what you are. We know what you did. Run while you still can." Her blood went cold, a sudden ice pick of adrenaline stabbing through her exhaustion. She didn't hesitate. Her training, the instincts she had inherited from a father who lived in the shadows, took over. She grabbed her M4, the metal cold and reassuring, and chambered around with a metallic clack that sounded like a thunderclap in the small room. She swept the corners, checking under the bed, the closet, the narrow gap behind the desk. The room was empty, but the violation was absolute. Someone knew where she was. Someone knew her personal number. Someone was watching. She called Duke immediately. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and alert. When she told him about the threat, the line went silent for a few agonizing seconds. He asked her how they could have possibly gotten her personal phone information, but he didn't wait for an answer. He told her to pack her gear and move. Within 10 minutes, she was back in his office, but the atmosphere had shifted from somber to high alert. This time, she wasn't alone. Martinez and Thompson flanked her, their rifles held at the ready, their eyes scanning the hallways as they moved. Duke was hunched over his computer, his fingers flying across the keys as he traced the digital footprint of the message. The results made the air in the room feel thin. It hadn't come from a satellite or a distant insurgent cell. It had been routed through the base's own internal network. The call was coming from inside the house. Martinez's grip tightened on his weapon, his knuckles white. Thompson suggested it might be a dead man's switch left by Rashid, an automated taunt sent out in the event of his capture. But Kira knew better. Her voice was steady, even as the fear crawled like 1,000 insects up her spine. She told them it was a warning, a way for someone to let her know that even with Rashid in a cell, the danger hadn't passed. Duke's computer emitted a sharp, final beep. He went pale, the blue light of the monitor casting ghostly shadows across his face. When Kira asked what he'd found, he looked up with eyes full of a new kind of dread. The message had been routed through the intelligence office. One name sat at the top of the access log: Rains. The pieces of the day fell into place with a horrible, jagged clarity. Rains, the man who had interrogated her with such clinical detachment. Rains, who had seemed far too interested in the technical specifics of what had happened on that ridge. He had access to everything: personnel files, encrypted communications, the very movements of every soul on the base. Kira breathed the words out like a curse. He was the leak. Duke cautioned her, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm, noting that they didn't have absolute proof yet. But Martinez didn't want to wait for a court-martial. He suggested they go have a conversation with the man themselves. They found Rains in his office, the space neat and orderly as if he were simply finishing a day's work. He was packing a small bag when they burst in. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look guilty. He just looked up and offered a cold, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. He greeted Duke calmly, stating he had been about to come find the commander. Duke's voice was flat, a low growl of suppressed rage, as he told Rains they had been looking for him too. Rains continued to pack, unconcerned by the 3 rifles pointed at his chest. He commented on the detention of Rashid, calling it a poor choice and noting that the insurgent wasn't the only asset they had on the base. The admission hung in the air like a gunshot, heavy and final. Martinez raised his rifle, the barrel leveling with Rains' forehead. Rains laughed, a dry, hollow sound. He mocked the idea of being a traitor, claiming he was simply cleaning up a mess. He called Rashid sloppy and stated his own job was merely damage control. When Duke demanded to know if threatening Specialist Ashford was part of that damage control, Rains corrected him. He hadn't threatened her. He had warned her. He zipped his bag and turned to face them fully, his composure absolute. He told them they didn't understand the reality of the situation. The base had been compromised for months by multiple actors and multiple leaks. He claimed the people he worked for didn't appreciate having their long-term operations disrupted by a sniper prodigy who had decided to play hero. Kira felt ice in her veins as she asked who he worked for. Rains shrugged, listing off a litany of alphabet agencies. CIA, DIA, groups that believed they knew how to win the war better than the men bleeding in the dirt. He revealed a devastating truth. The ambush on the convoy earlier that day hadn't just been a random attack. It had been a test. Someone had noticed the ghost daughter hiding in plain sight and wanted to confirm her identity. The ambush, which had cost the lives of 7 American soldiers, was nothing more than a field evaluation. Duke's voice shook with a visceral rage as he repeated the casualty count. Rains dismissed it as acceptable losses, the collateral damage of a larger game. He picked up his bag and moved toward the door, telling them he had a plane to catch. He dared them to stop him, claiming his people would have him out of custody in 6 hours regardless. He offered them a trade. Let him walk, and he would give them the names of 3 other traitors currently on the base payroll. He argued that if they killed him, they would spend the rest of their lives jumping at shadows, never knowing who to trust. Duke's hand was trembling on his sidearm, a silent war raging behind his eyes between the need for justice and the cold demands of pragmatism. It was Kira who spoke, her voice quiet and sharp. She demanded the names first. Rains looked at her with a flicker of genuine respect, noting that her father had taught her well. He pulled out a phone and displayed a list of 3 names, 2 enlisted soldiers and 1 officer. Thompson's voice was hollow as he realized people they had eaten with and stood guard with had sold them out for a paycheck. Duke made his decision, his voice turning to steel. He ordered the MPs to take Rains to detention, full security, no communications. Rains warned them they were making a mistake as he was dragged away, still wearing that infuriating superior smile. Duke collapsed into his chair, the weight of the 7 dead men pressing down on him. He whispered the number to the empty air, mourning the fact that they had died for a bureaucrat's theory. Kira felt a different kind of weight. It was a rage, pure and clean, the kind of heat that forged weapons. Martinez insisted on arresting the 3 names immediately, and Duke was already on the radio barking orders. Within minutes, the suspects were in custody, but the victory felt hollow to Kira. Something was wrong. She remembered the bag Rains had been packing. He had been planning to leave tonight, which meant he knew something was coming. He wasn't just running from an investigation, he was evacuating. She voiced her concern to Thompson, who realized the implication just as the world exploded. A massive blast rocked the building, the floor bucking beneath their feet. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the red glow of emergency strobes. Duke grabbed his radio, calling for a report. Through the static, a panicked voice reported a massive mortar attack and insurgents inside the perimeter. Another explosion followed, closer this time, shaking dust from the ceiling. Martinez swore, realizing this was the event Rains had been fleeing. The base was under a full-scale assault. Duke demanded a count, and the radio crackled with news of at least 20 insurgents breaching the eastern wall, the side where security had been thinned because everyone was focused on the internal traitors. Kira's mind raced with tactical clarity. It wasn't a random coincidence. The attack was coordinated, timed to hit the moment the base was most distracted. She suggested they were coming for Rains to silence him, or perhaps they were coming for her. Duke agreed, noting that she was the one who had dismantled their previous ambush. He made a split-second decision. He ordered Martinez and Thompson to get Kira to the armory for a full loadout. Kira protested that she wasn't going to hide, but Duke cut her off. He wasn't sending her to hide. He was sending her to get the right tools for the job. He thrust the M110 into her hands, the same rifle she had used on the ridge. He told her she had proven what she could do with it, and now it was time to do it again. They ran through a landscape of chaos. The air was filled with the screams of wounded men, the staccato rhythm of small arms fire, and the heavy thud of mortars. Soldiers were scrambling to defensive positions, their shadows dancing against the fires breaking out across the compound. The armory was a scene of controlled madness, with men grabbing ammunition and body armor in a desperate rush. Kira loaded magazines for the M110 with a practiced, mechanical efficiency. 30 rounds. It felt like nothing against the tide of darkness outside. Cain appeared through the smoke, blood trickling down his face from a concussive blast. He reported that the detention facility had been breached. Both Rashid and Rains were gone, either rescued by their allies or executed to keep them quiet. The attack had achieved its primary objectives, but the killing wasn't over. Duke's voice came over the radio, issuing a base-wide order, free engagement rules. If they weren't in uniform and were carrying a weapon, they were to be put down. He turned to Kira and gave her a single instruction: get to the roof. He needed her on the high ground, doing what she did best. She nodded, grabbed her gear, and headed for the stairs with Martinez and Thompson right behind her. The stairwell was a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel of shadow. Kira climbed, the M110 slung across her back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Yet as they emerged onto the roof, her hands remained perfectly steady. The view from the top was a vision of hell. 3 separate fires were consuming parts of the base, sending plumes of black smoke into the night sky. Tracer fire cut through the dark in long, glowing arcs. Kira didn't hesitate. She set up her bipod on the ledge, dialed her scope, and took a deep breath. Through the glass, the chaos of the night was filtered into a series of tactical problems. She saw 3 shooters on the east wall, pinning down a squad of soldiers below. Range, 400 meters. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, and the first shooter dropped. She adjusted her aim and fired again. The second man fell. The third tried to run, but there was no escaping the mechanical precision of her fire. 3 shots, 3 kills. Martinez was on the radio, acting as her spotter and calling out targets. He identified a mortar team in the northwest corner preparing for another strike. Kira swung the rifle, finding 5 men huddled around a tube 600 meters away. The wind was blowing from the south, a variable she calculated in a heartbeat. She fired. The man holding the mortar round dropped instantly. The others scattered like roaches, but Kira was faster. She tracked them, her finger working the trigger in a steady, lethal rhythm. One by one, they fell into the dust. When the remaining 2 found cover, Thompson used a grenade launcher to flush them out. As soon as they broke cover, Kira was there, waiting. She remembered her father's voice, a ghost in her ear, telling her that panic makes people predictable. She waited for the moment they committed to a direction and then ended it. Martinez breathed a word of disbelief as he counted 8 kills in under 2 minutes. But Kira wasn't listening. She was hunting. She scanned the compound, looking for the flicker of a muzzle flash or the silhouette of a head against the firelight. She spotted a sniper on a building across the compound trying to get an angle on the command center. At 900 meters, it was a shot most wouldn't even attempt in the daylight, let alone the dark. She fired. The sniper tumbled from the roof. Duke's voice crackled over the radio, urging the ghost on the roof to keep it up, telling her she was cutting them apart. Kira reloaded without looking, her hands moving through muscle memory as she scanned for more threats. 10 down, 12, 15. The numbers were just data points now, markers of a growing distance between her and the person she used to be. Suddenly, Martinez grabbed her shoulder, his voice urgent. He had spotted a large group moving on the north side, at least 20 hostiles moving with a discipline that the insurgents lacked. Kira swung the scope toward them and felt a cold knot form in her stomach. These men didn't run or shout. They moved in tactical wedges, covering each other's sectors, using the shadows with professional expertise. They weren't fighting for a cause, they were fighting for a paycheck. Mercenaries. And they were heading straight for her building. Thompson realized they were the targets. Everything else had been a distraction to draw the base's attention away from the sniper prodigy. They were less than 2 minutes away. Kira started firing into the group, trying to slow their advance. She took down 3 in rapid succession, but the others didn't break. They simply adjusted their formation and kept coming. They were at 300 meters, then 200. Thompson shouted that they needed to fall back, but Martinez pointed out they would be in the building before they could even reach the stairs. Kira made a decision that would have made her father proud and her mother weep. She told the 2 men to go downstairs and hold the stairwell. She would stay on the roof and buy them every second she could. They hesitated, but Kira turned to them, her eyes hard and cold. She told them she wasn't the quiet comms girl anymore. She was a sniper, and this was what snipers did. They held the ground that no one else could. Martinez swore, but he recognized the truth in her voice. They vanished into the stairwell, leaving Kira alone under the stars. She went back to the rifle. 4 down, 5, 6. She could see their faces now, the grit and determination of professional killers. They were at 100 meters. She could hear the roar of gunfire from below as Martinez and Thompson engaged the first wave in the stairwell. Kira stood up, slung the M110, and drew her sidearm. If they made it past her teammates, she was going to be the last thing they ever saw. The noise from the floor below was a symphony of violence, grenades, screams, and the frantic barking of rifles. Then a sudden, terrifying silence. Kira's heart stopped. She aimed her pistol at the door, her finger tightening on the trigger, ready to die if it meant taking one more of them with her. The door burst open, and Martinez stumbled out, clutching a bleeding shoulder. Thompson followed, limping heavily but still upright. He gasped out that they were all down. The radio crackled again. Duke's voice announced that the hostiles were retreating and ordered a ceasefire. It was over. Kira stood at the edge of the roof, looking out over the devastation. The base was a scarred landscape of fire and bodies. She had killed at least 15 more tonight, bringing her total to 37 in a single day. Her father had been a legend for his 200 kills over a 20-year career. At this rate, she would surpass him before the year was out. The thought should have been horrifying, but as she stood there in the cooling Afghan night, it just felt like destiny. Duke found them on the roof 20 minutes later. His face was a mask of grim satisfaction. He reported 43 hostile casualties against 9 of their own. When Kira asked about Rains, Duke confirmed he was gone, along with Rashid. The extraction team had been too fast, too well coordinated. They had lost the source, but they had gained a terrifying amount of knowledge. Someone high up wanted Kira tested, then eliminated. She had passed the test, but the cost was her soul. Cain appeared, looking at Kira with a sense of awe that bordered on fear. He told her he had counted her kills. 37 confirmed in one day. He apologized for being wrong about her, acknowledging that she had saved the base and his own life. Kira looked at his outstretched hand and thought about the promise she had made to her mother. She shook his hand, telling him he hadn't been entirely wrong. She had been lying, just not in the way he thought. The next morning, the sun rose over a base that would never be the same. Kira stood in Duke's office one last time, looking at the orders that had come through. She was being transferred to Fort Benning for advanced sniper training. Duke told her she could refuse, that she could go back to her old life. But they both knew that was a lie. The world knew what she was now, and they would never let her be anything else. She wasn't just a girl with a rifle, she was a weapon. She told Duke she couldn't unfire those bullets. She couldn't unknow the calm she felt when the crosshairs settled on a target. Duke asked what she would tell her mother. Kira said she would tell her the truth, that she had broken her promise and that she wasn't the same person who had left. She wondered if her mother would look at her and see the husband she had lost or the daughter she had tried to save. As she walked toward the waiting helicopter, Martinez caught her. He handed her the M110 wrapped in cloth. He told her she had earned it and that her father would have wanted her to have it. He left her with one final thought, that she shouldn't forget why she did it. Her father killed as a job, she killed to keep people alive. As the helicopter lifted off and the mountains of Afghanistan began to shrink below her, Kira pulled out her phone. She typed a message to her mother, an honest, raw confession of what she had become. She stared at the words for a long time, the weight of them heavier than the rifle in her lap. Then she deleted them. She typed a simpler message, a kind lie about a new training assignment. She told her mother not to worry, that she knew what she was doing now. The helicopter flew on over terrain that Kira now viewed as a tactical map. She looked at the peaks and valleys and saw only lines of sight and points of cover. She was no longer running from her father's legacy. She was a sniper, the ghost's daughter, a weapon forged in the fire of FOB Sentinel. The world had underestimated the quiet girl in the corner, and they had paid for it in blood. She was the best they never saw coming, and she was finally at peace with the truth. Sometimes, breaking a promise was the only way to save a life, and true strength was stepping into the shadow so that others could live in the light.